The silence was everywhere. Not the comforting kind that settles in after a day's work, but the silence of an Earth forgotten. A planet where billions once lived, now reduced to a quiet hum, like the last sigh of a dying animal. Earth wasn't what it used to be, not after 10,000 years of submission. Not after a millennia-long rule of alien overlords who never once looked upon the people as more than an afterthought. Captain Elias Varro stood on the bridge of the Aegis of Dawn, staring out into the blackness ahead. He could feel the weight of every moment, pressing on him with an intensity he had learned to carry over the years. It wasn't the responsibility of command that gnawed at him now. It was something more profound, an awareness that whatever came next would define not just his life, but the fate of everyone left on the planet below. That thought sat on his chest, heavy and unshakable. For years, they had lived under the shadow of the Kyran Empire, a force so vast that Earth's defiance was less than a footnote in their history. Humanity had been broken, scattered, hidden under layers of bureaucratic indifference and brutal control. But the Aegis, this ship, was their first answer, their first weapon, not just a machine of war, but a statement that Earth had not forgotten its history, that its people had not lost the capacity for resistance. Varro's hand rested on the railing as he surveyed the crew below, busy at their stations. They were the best Earth had left, but even they moved with a quiet trepidation. No one was eager. No one was cocky. They knew this wasn't a mission to be won with firepower alone. It was a gamble, a desperate strike against a foe that saw them as little more than animals to be herded. It was not hope that drove them forward. It was the question of whether they still had the right to hope at all. Captain Commander Layla Reyes, his second in command, spoke quietly at his side. Her voice cut through the quiet like a blade, but it didn't shatter it. Nothing could. We're approaching the outer perimeter. No signs of detection yet. He nodded, acknowledging her without turning his gaze. The perimeter she spoke of wasn't just any border, it was the invisible wall that had encased Earth for millennia. The Kyrans hadn't needed to build physical barriers. They simply shut Earth out, shut them away. Humanity had become prisoners on their own planet, locked in the confines of a galactic backwater, while the Empire expanded, unconcerned with their fate. And yet here they were, about to break through that barrier. The thought wasn't exhilarating. It was sobering. The Kyrans hadn't responded to Earth's silence because they never expected anything from them again. That was the crux of it. To them, humanity was finished. In their minds, Earth was a remnant of a species that had already lost. "Engage stealth systems," Varro said. His voice, low and calm, belied the tension that twisted in his gut. Reyes nodded to the team at navigation, and the hum of the ship's systems shifted. The lights dimmed slightly, the hull vibrating almost imperceptibly as the Aegis prepared to slip past the Empire's vast network of sensors. Varro knew the ship was built for this, but knowing and trusting were two different things. There was no room for error. "Captain, we're clear of Earth's atmosphere," came the voice of Lieutenant Aaron Haven, their chief navigator. His hands moved smoothly over the control interface, eyes focused but distant. He was the youngest on the bridge, but there was something about the way he held himself that suggested years beyond his age. Perhaps it was the war. Perhaps it was just how people lived now, old before their time, waiting for a life they'd never see. "Understood," Varro said. His mind flickered to the people still on Earth, huddled in their homes, eyes turned to the sky. No one knew if the Aegis would ever return. No one knew if it could. "Do you think they're watching?" Haven asked quietly. His voice carried a weight that made Varro turn his head. "Who?" Varro asked, though he knew the answer. "The Kyrans." The captain considered this for a moment. "They don't need to watch. To them, we're beneath notice." Haven didn't respond. He didn't need to. The unspoken truth lingered between them. Earth had been left alone because it was assumed dead. Forgotten in the margins of a galaxy that stretched too far and too wide to care about such a small, insignificant corner. But they weren't dead. Not yet. As the Aegis moved further from Earth, Varro could feel the shift. They were moving into territory no human had entered in millennia. He had studied the old records, the fragments left behind from the days when humans were explorers, conquerors even, before the Kyrans came. He wondered if anyone on those old ships had ever imagined a day when humanity would become slaves in their own home. And yet, here he was, leading the charge, not out of choice, but because no one else would. No one else could. "Captain," Reyes said again, drawing his attention back. "We're approaching the jump point." Varro nodded. The jump point was where the real risk began. Once they crossed into FTL travel, they would be at the mercy of the Kyran Empire's vast network of patrols, drones, and sensors. It wasn't a matter of if they were detected, it was when. And when that moment came, the fate of the mission would rest on how long they could evade the inevitable. "Prepare for jump," he ordered, turning his gaze to the viewscreen. Beyond the blackness, the stars glittered, cold and indifferent. Somewhere out there, past the edge of human memory, lay the empire that had held them in chains for so long. He wondered, not for the first time, if humanity was ready for what came next. If he was ready. The hum of the ship shifted again as the engines powered up for the jump. Varro's grip on the railing tightened. The silence that followed was not the silence of waiting, it was the silence of a species on the edge of extinction, ready to strike at the only thing left that could save them or destroy them. Reyes glanced at him, her face set in stone. "Are you sure about this, Elias?" He met her gaze. There was no answer that would satisfy either of them. "We don't have a choice." The words felt hollow, even to him, but they were true. Whatever came next, they couldn't go back. That was the nature of the fight they had chosen. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing up, about reclaiming something they had lost long before the Kyrans had come. It wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about reminding the universe that Earth still existed. Reyes gave a slight nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. She understood. They all did. No one on this ship had illusions about heroism or glory. They were beyond that. What lay ahead wasn't a battle for victory. It was a battle to exist, to prove they hadn't been erased. "Jump in 5, Haven said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Varro let out a slow breath. He didn't feel fear, exactly. It was something deeper, something more primal. The quiet knowledge that nothing would be the same after this moment. The countdown began. The stars on the viewscreen seemed to stretch, their light bending as the ship prepared to leave its place in the galaxy's forgotten shadows and enter the heart of the Empire's gaze. And then, with a flicker, they were gone. The silence that followed was absolute. The Aegis of Dawn emerged from the jump like a ship breaking through the surface of an unknown ocean. The stars returned, though they seemed further away now, distant and cold in the vastness of space. The silence lingered, not as a comfort, but as a reminder of what lay ahead. For the first time in millennia, humanity had crossed the barrier. They were no longer confined, no longer tethered to the forgotten corner of their galaxy. But that freedom came with a cost. Captain Elias Varro stood at the center of the bridge, his hands gripping the edge of the command console, eyes still fixed on the stars. He didn't move, didn't speak. The silence wasn't just external. It was inside him, filling the spaces left behind by doubt, uncertainty, and the crushing weight of responsibility. He could feel it each of his crew members, each pair of eyes that glanced toward him, waiting for his next move. They were expecting him to lead, to be decisive, to know the right path forward. But did he? He'd been trained for this, born into a generation that knew only subjugation. Their rebellion was a quiet one, born in secret meetings and whispered conversations in the darkened rooms of hidden bases. It had been an idea before it became a reality. And now, the reality was here. "All systems stable," Reyes said, breaking the silence. She stood beside him, her posture rigid, eyes scanning the data in front of her. "We've cleared the jump without detection. No signs of pursuit." Varro nodded, but her words didn't bring relief. Instead, they left him with a gnawing uncertainty that refused to fade. If the Kyrans hadn't detected them, did it mean they hadn't noticed? Or did it mean they didn't care? He turned toward Reyes, his eyes meeting hers. "They'll notice us soon enough." She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Maybe, but that's the plan, isn't it? Varro didn't answer right away. The plan. The Aegis of Dawn had been built for this moment, a symbol of humanity's resurgence. But now, standing here, commanding this ship, the questions that had haunted him for years rose to the surface. What was this really about? Revenge? Freedom? Survival? Could humanity reclaim its dignity without becoming the very thing that had once destroyed them? We've been unnoticed for centuries, Varro said quietly, more to himself than to her. They didn't need to watch us because we weren't a threat. We weren't even worth the effort. Ray's lips tightened, but she remained silent. She had always been a soldier, always the one to push forward, to focus on the mission. It wasn't that she lacked empathy, but Varro knew she had learned long ago to bury those feelings deep. In a way, he envied her ability to stay focused, to push past the doubts that gnawed at him like a constant shadow. Now they'll notice, he continued, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. And when they do, they'll come for us. Hard. This won't be a skirmish. It'll be annihilation. They'll want to erase the very idea of our resistance. Reyes finally spoke, her tone even, though her words were sharp. And what choice do we have? Sit in silence for another 10,000 years. Varro turned to face her fully now, his jaw clenched. The tension between them was palpable, not born of anger, but of two perspectives clashing in the dark. No, but we need to understand what we're fighting for. What will become when this is over? Reyes raised an eyebrow. What will become? Varro stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. We've been subjugated for so long, Layla. Beaten, controlled, humiliated. But before that, we were conquerors. We had our own empire, our own arrogance. Are we any different now? Or are we just trying to take back the power we lost? Reyes held his gaze, her expression softening just slightly. You think we'll become like them? The Kyrans? I think we could, Varro admitted, if we're not careful. Her eyes narrowed, considering his words. And if we don't fight, if we don't take back what's ours, then what? We stay subservient. We accept the place they've given us in the galaxy. Varro shook his head. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? She pressed, her voice rising slightly. Because right now, it sounds like you're questioning this whole mission. I'm questioning why we're doing it, he replied, his tone firm but not defensive. We can fight for our survival without losing ourselves in the process. I just don't know if we've figured out how yet. Reyes crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. Survival is all that matters, Elias. We don't have the luxury of debating philosophy when the Empire is out there, ready to crush us the moment we show any weakness. Varro sighed, running a hand through his short cropped hair. He knew she was right, in a way. Survival was the priority. But there was something deeper gnawing at him, something that refused to be silenced by the immediate threat of the Kyrans. Before he could respond, Heaven's voice broke through the tension, calm but inquisitive. Do we fight for freedom, or do we fight for power? Both Varro and Reyes turned toward him. The young navigator had been silent up until now, but there was a sharp intelligence in his eyes that belied his youth. He stood at his station, hands resting on the control panel, but his attention was clearly on the conversation unfolding between the two senior officers. Is there a difference? Reyes asked, her tone edged with impatience. Haven nodded, his gaze thoughtful. There is. Fighting for freedom means we want to live without chains. Fighting for power means we want to place others in chains. Reyes let out a small, humorless laugh. That's idealistic. The Kyrans won't care about the difference. They'll kill us either way. Haven shrugged. Maybe, but if we don't know why we're fighting, then we risk becoming the very thing we're trying to escape. That's the cycle of history, isn't it? Varro watched the younger man closely. Haven had always been an oddity among the crew, a philosopher in the body of a soldier. He questioned everything, always seeking a deeper meaning in what most people saw as simple facts. It was both a strength and a flaw, depending on the situation. The Empire fell because of arrogance, Varro said quietly, more to himself than to the others. We can't make the same mistakes. Reyes shook her head, frustration evident in her posture. We're not them, Elias. We're not going to enslave the galaxy. We just want our freedom. Do we? Heaven asked, his voice soft but pointed. Rey's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her response in check. What are you suggesting? That we don't fight, that we just lay down and let them keep us as slaves? I'm suggesting, Heaven replied, his tone calm, that we think carefully about the kind of freedom we're fighting for. If all we want is to tear down the Kyrans, we might not like what we become in the process. Varro felt a chill run through him at Heaven's words. He had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it voiced aloud brought the weight of the thought crashing down around him. Humanity had been broken before, crushed under the heel of a greater power, but the Aegis wasn't just a symbol of resistance, it was a reminder of who they used to be, of the potential they had to rise and to fall again. We need to stay focused, Varro said after a long silence. The Kyrans will come for us, but we have to make sure that when they do, we're fighting for more than just revenge. Reyes stared at him for a moment, her anger softening into something else. She didn't agree, but she understood. That was enough for now. Understood, Captain, she said quietly. The conversation ended, but the tension lingered, hanging in the air like the remnants of a storm. Varro turned back to the stars, his mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. What were they fighting for? Was it freedom or something darker? And could humanity rise without falling into the same traps that had ensnared them before? His gaze drifted to the stars, distant and cold, and he wondered how many of them had witnessed civilizations rise and fall, crushed under the weight of their own ambition. Captain, Heaven's voice broke his reverie, soft but insistent. We're approaching the next jump point. Varro nodded, his thoughts still heavy. Prepare for the jump. As the hum of the engines filled the silence, Varro closed his eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. The choices he made now would ripple through the galaxy, shaping not just his future, but the future of every human still left on Earth. But could they rise without becoming the very thing they hated? The hum grew louder, the stars stretched once more, and the Aegis prepared to leap forward again into the unknown, into the Empire's waiting gaze. As the ship vanished into the void, Varro whispered the question to the darkness. Can we ever truly be free? The silence answered him with nothing at all. The hum of the engines faded as the Aegis of Dawn completed its jump, the ship sliding into a quiet orbit around Mars. The once red planet was now a silent, desolate wasteland, its once thriving colonies and cities long abandoned. Dust storms roamed its surface like forgotten specters, erasing the last traces of humanity's past. This was where Earth's last great push for freedom had ended, the final battleground where human resistance had been shattered. Captain Elias Varro stood at the observation deck, staring down at the planet below. The weight of history pressed against him, heavier now than ever before. Mars had been a symbol of hope once. It was where humanity had reached out to the stars, where they had first dared to dream of expanding beyond the confines of Earth. But now, all that remained were ruins, buried under layers of dust and time. Reyes stood beside him, her arms crossed as she studied the planet. Her usual sharpness was tempered, softened by the sight below. Hard to believe this is where it all started. Where it ended, too, Varro muttered, his gaze still fixed on the surface. A long silence stretched between them. The crew was busy, preparing for their mission, but for a moment, it felt as if the whole ship was holding its breath, waiting for anything to stir in the empty void of the past. Mars had been the last stand, the final battlefield in a war they had never been able to win. The Kyrans had descended with overwhelming force, crushing the last remnants of human resistance with cold efficiency. The war had ended in a single, decisive blow, and humanity had been reduced to a fractured, subjugated race, isolated from the galaxy for thousands of years. You think there's anything left down there? Reyes asked, breaking the silence. Varro didn't answer immediately. His mind was drifting, not just to the past, but to the artifacts buried beneath the Martian surface. Old warships, long-forgotten technology, the relics of a time when humanity had once dared to challenge the galaxy. Those ruins held more than just memories. They held secrets that could change everything if they were uncovered. "We'll find out soon enough," he said quietly, turning away from the observation deck. Reyes followed him, her footsteps silent on the cold steel floor. "You don't seem too excited about this mission." "It's not about excitement," Varro replied, his voice measured. "It's about what we're digging up. These ruins, they're more than just pieces of history. They're reminders of what we were, what we became." "And you think we'll make the same mistakes," Reyes said, her tone not accusatory, but thoughtful. Varro glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "History has a way of repeating itself." She didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered his words. "Maybe, but if we're careful, we can avoid those mistakes, learn from them instead of repeating them." Varro's gaze drifted back to the planet below. "That's the hope, isn't it?" Hours later, a small shuttle descended toward the Martian surface, its engines humming softly as it touched down on the edge of an ancient ruin. Dust swirled around the landing site, but the ruins were still partially visible jagged structures, half buried in the red dirt, their shapes worn by centuries of erosion. Varro, Reyes, and a small team of engineers and scientists stepped out of the shuttle, their boots sinking into the soft dust. The air was thin, barely breathable even through their filtration masks, but the silence was suffocating in its own way. "This is it," Dr. Aaron Haven said, his voice muffled through the mask. He was kneeling beside one of the structures, brushing away the dust with gloved hands. "These ruins date back to the first human expansion into space. Early 22nd century, if the markings are anything to go by." Varro stepped closer, his eyes scanning the faint symbols etched into the stone. They were worn, almost illegible, but they spoke of a time when humanity had been on the brink of greatness. This place had once been a colony, a thriving outpost in the early days of space exploration. Now it was little more than a graveyard. "It's hard to believe," Varro muttered, more to himself than to the others. "We built all of this, and now it's forgotten, buried." Haven glanced up at him, his eyes sharp behind his mask. "Nothing is ever truly forgotten, Captain. Not if you're willing to dig deep enough." Reyes, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "There's something here, isn't there? Something more than just ruins." Varro didn't answer right away. He could feel it too, the sense that they were standing on the edge of something far greater than themselves. The past wasn't just a distant memory here. It was alive, breathing beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. "We need to move carefully," Varro said finally, turning to face his team. "Whatever we find here, we don't know what it'll mean for the future." Reyes frowned. "You think this place is dangerous?" "I think the past is dangerous," Varro replied, his voice steady. "We came here for answers, but those answers could change everything." Hours passed as the team worked, uncovering more of the ruins. What had once been a simple colony was revealed to be something far more complex, a hidden military base, complete with underground bunkers and old, rusted-out warships. The deeper they dug, the more they found artifacts, old data terminals, pieces of technology that had been lost to time. Varro stood at the entrance to one of the bunkers, watching as the engineers pried open the heavy metal door. It creaked loudly, a sound that echoed across the empty landscape, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. "This is it," Haven said quietly, stepping forward. "This is what we came here for." The bunker was dark, the air inside stale and thick with dust. Varro's flashlight flickered as he moved through the narrow corridors, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The walls were lined with old data terminals, their screens cracked and dark, but still intact. This place had been abandoned in a hurry, left to rot in the aftermath of the Kyran invasion. Reyes moved beside him, her eyes scanning the darkness. "What do you think we'll find in here?" Varro didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, his thoughts tangled with the weight of history. This place was a relic of a time when humanity had been on the brink of destruction, a reminder of the mistakes they had made in their pursuit of power. "We'll find the truth," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, "whether we're ready for it or not." Hours later, they uncovered it. Deep in the heart of the bunker, buried beneath layers of dust and debris, they found an ancient data terminal. It was old, but still functional, its screen flickering to life as Haven connected it to his portable power source. Varro stood behind him, watching as the data streamed across the screen. Old logs, messages, records of battles fought and lost. And then, deeper in the system, something else, something far more dangerous. This is it," Haven whispered, his eyes wide. "The last transmission from Mars. The final orders given before the Kyrans arrived." Varro's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. The final message was brief, but its meaning was clear. "They're coming. We've lost the war, but there's still a chance. The key to our survival lies buried beneath the surface. Do not let them find it." Varro's blood ran cold. The key to their survival hidden beneath the Martian surface for centuries. Whatever it was, it had been important enough for humanity to risk everything to keep it from the Kyrans. "What does it mean?" Reyes asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Varro shook his head, his mind racing. "It means we're not just digging up the past. We're digging up something far more dangerous." Haven leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "The key to our survival, whatever it is, the Kyrans didn't find it. And now, we might be the only ones who can." Varro felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavier than ever before. This wasn't just about uncovering history. This was about the future, about what humanity would become. The ruins beneath Mars held the answers, but they also held the potential for destruction. "We need to proceed carefully," Varro said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Whatever's down there, it could change everything." Reyes nodded, but her eyes were hard. "We're not just fighting for freedom anymore, are we?" Varro didn't answer. He didn't need to. The past was echoing all around them, louder now than ever before, and the future was waiting, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to decide what humanity would become. As the team prepared to delve deeper into the Martian ruins, Varro stood alone for a moment, staring down at the planet's desolate surface. The silence weighed heavy on his mind, but there was no turning back now. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but it was a path they had to walk. He thought of the message they had found, of the final, desperate plea of those who had come before. They had fought for survival, just as humanity was fighting now. But the question that lingered, unspoken but undeniable, was whether survival was enough. "Survival isn't living," Varro whispered to the empty air, his voice barely audible. And as the Martian winds howled across the barren landscape, the weight of that truth settled deep within him. The silent hum of the Aegis of Dawn was broken only by the soft clicks of control panels and the murmured voices of the bridge crew. Captain Elias Varro stood at the center, his eyes scanning the data feeds in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The message they had uncovered from Mars still echoed in his thoughts, like a shadow that refused to be ignored. Reyes, standing beside him, broke the silence. "We've picked up movement on long-range sensors. It's them." Varro's jaw tightened. "How many?" "One fleet. Small, but it's definitely Kyran," Reyes replied, her voice steady. "Looks like a forward patrol." Varro nodded slowly, his gaze hardening. The Kyrans had always kept a close watch on humanity's activities, ensuring that their old subjects never rose too far from the ashes. And now, with the Aegis fully operational, humanity was no longer a whisper in the galactic void. The Kyrans had noticed, and they were coming. "Put them on screen," Varro ordered. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the Kyran fleet, a collection of sleek, angular warships, their surfaces shimmering with energy fields. They moved with an eerie grace, their formation tight and disciplined. These ships were smaller than the massive dreadnoughts the Kyrans were known for, but even a patrol fleet was more than enough to wipe out most human vessels. Reyes crossed her arms, studying the screen. "We're not going to be able to avoid them, are we?" Varro shook his head. "No, they're here for us." A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Everyone knew what was at stake. The Aegis was humanity's last, best hope for reclaiming a place in the galaxy, but this was their first test, a confrontation with a very empire that had crushed them so long ago. Victory here would mean much more than just survival. It would be a statement, a declaration that humanity was no longer content to cower in the shadows. But defeat would be the end. Not just of the Aegis, but of everything they had fought for. "Open a channel," Varro said. The communications officer nodded, his fingers dancing over the controls. A moment later, the screen shifted, revealing the cold, impassive face of a Kyran commander. His skin was a dull, metallic gray, his eyes sharp and calculating. Behind him, the command deck of his ship hummed with quiet efficiency. "Captain Varro," the Kyran's voice was smooth, almost bored, as if he were speaking to an insect rather than an equal. "I see you've decided to leave your cage. Bold, but ultimately pointless." Varro met the Kyran's gaze without flinching. "We're not interested in your games, Commander. If you're here to test us, you'll get your answer soon enough." The Kyran commander raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of amusement flickering across his face. "Test you? No, Captain. There's no need for that. We already know what you are, an outdated relic, clinging to the hope that you can rise above your station. But history has already proven otherwise, hasn't it?" Varro's hands tightened into fists at his sides. The calm in his voice was forced, but he refused to let the Kyran see his anger. "History isn't written yet." The Kyran's smile was cold. "No, but it's about to be, and you will play your part just as your ancestors did." The channel cut out, and the screen returned to the image of the Kyran fleet, now moving into attack formation. Varro turned to Reyes, his expression hardening. "Battle stations," he ordered. The bridge transformed into a hive of activity, but beneath the controlled chaos was a tension that weighed on everyone. This wasn't a drill. This was their first real fight, and it would define everything that came after. Reyes moved to her station, barking out orders as the weapon systems came online. The Aegis's crew worked with the precision of years of training, but even so, there was a palpable sense of uncertainty. No one on this ship had ever fought a Kyran fleet before. No human had, not for thousands of years. "They're moving into firing range," Reyes called out, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. "They'll be in position in 30 seconds. Varro nodded, his gaze locked on the screen. He could see the Kyran ships forming a tight, spear-like formation, designed to punch through weaker defenses. But the Aegis wasn't weak. It was humanity's strongest ship, a war machine built in secret over decades. They weren't the same scattered resistance fighters the Kyrans had crushed in the past. "Hold fire until I give the order," Varro said, his voice calm and steady. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears pressing down on the bridge. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching out into eternity. The Kyran ships drew closer, their weapons powering up, ready to deliver the first blow. The silence before the storm. "Now!" Varro shouted. The Aegis unleashed its full arsenal. Massive railguns roared to life, sending slugs of metal hurtling through the void at impossible speeds. Swarms of missiles streaked toward the Kyran ships, their trails glowing against the darkness of space. Energy beams lanced out, cutting through the distance with precision. The Kyrans responded in kind. Their ships erupted with fire, energy blasts and plasma torpedoes filling the space between the two fleets. The Aegis shook under the impact, but its shields held, absorbing the brunt of the attack. "Shields holding at 70%, Reyes reported, her voice sharp but focused. Varro watched as the first Kyran ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, its hull torn apart by the Aegis's guns. But there were more. The Kyrans pressed forward, undeterred by the loss of one of their own. They moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency that had made them the dominant force in the galaxy for 10,000 years. "They're trying to flank us," Reyes warned, her fingers flying over the controls. "Adjusting shields." "Bring the forward batteries online," Varro ordered. "Concentrate fire on the lead ship." The battle raged on, brutal and unrelenting. The Aegis was taking hits, its shields flickering under the constant barrage, but its weapons were tearing through the Kyran fleet with deadly precision. For every human ship that fell, 2 Kyran vessels were destroyed, but the cost was high. "Captain, we've lost the Pillar of Hope," one of the officers reported, his voice tight with tension. Varro's jaw clenched, but he didn't allow himself the luxury of grief. The Pillar of Hope had been one of their escort ships, crewed by hundreds of men and women. They had known the risks. They had all known. "Focus on the task at hand," he said, his voice hard. "We can't afford to lose focus now." The battle was nearing its climax. The Kyran fleet was in disarray, their formations breaking under the relentless assault of the Aegis. But victory wasn't enough. Varro knew that. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about sending a message. "We've got them on the run," Reyes said, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. "They're retreating." Varro stared at the screen, watching as the remaining Kyran ships began to fall back, their engines burning bright as they fled the battlefield. It was over. They had won. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a hollow feeling settled in Varro's chest. The Kyrans had underestimated them this time, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. This victory, as satisfying as it was, would only provoke a stronger response. The Kyrans would come back, and next time, they would be ready. Reyes turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What's next, Captain?" Varro didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the retreating Kyran fleet, his mind turning over the same question that had haunted him since Mars. They had won the battle, but at what cost? And how far were they willing to go in this fight? "Prepare the ship for repairs," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "We've only just begun." Hours later, the bridge was quiet. The battle was over, and the crew had returned to their stations, but the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. Varro sat alone in his quarters, staring at the datapad in front of him. The reports were coming in: damage assessments, casualty lists, strategic analyses, but none of it felt real. He had commanded a battle, a victory, but there was no triumph in it. The cost of war had already begun to weigh on him, and this was only the first fight. How many more lives would be lost? How many more ships would be torn apart before they found their way through this? He thought of the Kyran commander's words, of the cold certainty with which he had spoken. The Kyrans believed that humanity was nothing more than a relic of the past, something to be swept aside and forgotten. But humanity was more than that. They had to be more. But what if they weren't? Varro leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed, the soft hum of the ship lulling him into a restless contemplation. Victory had been theirs today, but in the grand scheme of things, it meant little. The war was far from over, and the path ahead was dark. "Survival isn't living," he whispered again, the words heavy in the stillness of the room. And with that thought, he drifted into a sleep troubled by dreams of battles yet to come. The soft glow of the monitors barely did Captain Elias Varro's quarters as he stared at the casualty list. The names scrolled slowly, each one piercing deeper into him. He didn't need to see it to know Lieutenant Mary Quinn was among them. Her name was there, just as he had feared. He closed his eyes and let the silence engulf him. Quinn had been a friend, more than just another officer under his command. They had served together for years, through the endless nights of planning and waiting, while humanity prepared for a war it had hoped would never come. He remembered her laughter, her unwavering belief in the mission. Her presence on the bridge had always been a comfort, a reminder that there were still people worth fighting for. And now, she was gone. Varro leaned back in his chair, the cold steel pressing against his spine as he fought to keep his composure. The room was suffocating, the air too still. There was a heaviness that clung to everything now, a weight that had settled on his shoulders since the battle. Victory should have felt different, but it hadn't. Not after the cost. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, as if the act could somehow release the burden he carried. But it wouldn't. Not now, not ever. The door to his quarters chimed softly. He didn't move for a moment, still lost in the quiet. But then he straightened and forced himself to speak. "Enter." The door slid open with a faint hiss, and Commander Layla Reyes stepped inside. Her expression carefully neutral. She had always been like that, steady, unshakable. Varro envied her for it. "Captain," Reyes said, her voice measured, "I thought I'd check in on you." Varro didn't respond immediately. He glanced down at the datapad in his hand, then set it aside with deliberate slowness. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "How are the repairs coming?" he asked finally. Though he already knew the answer, it was easier to focus on something tangible, something that didn't require him to think about the lives he couldn't save. "Slow but steady," Reyes replied. "We've restored the primary systems, but it'll be a few days before we're back to full operational capacity." Varro nodded. It was what he expected, but the news did little to lighten the mood. The silence stretched between them again, heavier this time, and Reyes didn't make any effort to break it. When she finally did speak, her words were quiet, almost tentative. "I saw the casualty report." Varro's gaze flickered, the mention of the report enough to stir the emotions he had been trying to suppress. He nodded again, unable to form a coherent response. "Lieutenant Quinn," Reyes hesitated, her usual confidence wavering for just a moment. "I'm sorry, Elias. I know what she meant to you." There it was. The truth, spoken aloud. It cut through him like a blade, sharper than anything the Kyrans could have thrown at them. Varro closed his eyes for a brief second, trying to steady himself. "She knew the risks," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We all did." Reyes stepped closer, her expression softening. "That doesn't make it any easier." Varro didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he rose from his seat and moved toward the viewport, staring out at the endless stretch of stars beyond. The galaxy seemed so distant, so indifferent. Out there, entire worlds were spinning, unaware of the lives lost in this small corner of space. "What's the value of a single life, Layla?" he asked, his voice distant. "In a universe this vast, does it even matter?" Reyes watched him carefully, her brow furrowing at the question. "Of course, it matters. Every life matters." Varro shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the stars. "I keep telling myself that. But then we lose someone like Mary, and I start to wonder." He paused, his breath catching in his throat. "How many more will we lose before this is over? How many more names will I have to add to that list?" Reyes didn't answer immediately. She stepped beside him, her reflection joining his in the glass. "That's the burden of command, isn't it?" she said quietly. "Making choices that no one should have to make." Varro clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms tightening. "I keep thinking about the Kyrans, about what they said during the battle." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. "They don't see us as a threat, Layla. They don't even see us as equals. To them, we're relics of a failed past, something to be swept aside and forgotten." Reyes met his gaze steadily. "They've underestimated us." "Maybe," Varro said, his voice heavy with doubt. "But does it matter? Even if we win a few battles, even if we fight back, what's the point if we become just like them? What if, in trying to reclaim what we lost, we lose everything that made us human in the first place?" Reyes didn't flinch at the question. Instead, she considered his words carefully before responding. "I don't have an answer for that, Elias. But I know one thing. If we don't fight for something, we'll have nothing left. And we can't let the fear of what might happen stop us from doing what we know is right." Varro let out a bitter laugh. "What's right? I wish it were that simple." "It never is," Reyes replied, her voice firm but gentle. "But we make choices because we have to. That's what leadership is. It's not about having all the answers or making the perfect decisions. It's about carrying the weight of those decisions, no matter how heavy. Varro stared at her, the exhaustion evident in his eyes. And what if I'm not strong enough to carry it? Reyes placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. You are. You always have been. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the oppressive silence of loss or uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding, of shared burdens. Varro looked back at the stars, his heart still heavy, but somehow lighter knowing he wasn't carrying it alone. Later, when Reyes had left, Varro returned to his desk, the casualty report still open on the screen. He stared at it for a long time before finally closing the file. There was no point in dwelling on it now. The dead were gone, and no amount of guilt or regret would bring them back. But their loss would stay with him. Each name was a reminder of the responsibility he carried. Every decision he made from here on out would be colored by the lives he had failed to save. And there would be more. He knew that. The war had only just begun. He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling like a storm in his mind. What had Reyes said? Every life mattered. But did it? Could he truly believe that when he had to weigh those lives against the future of an entire species? Varro closed his eyes, his hand coming to rest on his forehead. His head throbbed with the weight of it all, the war, the lives lost, the choices he had yet to make. He didn't have the luxury of doubt. Not anymore. Command was a burden, but it was one he had chosen. And now he had to live with it. He thought of Quinn again, of her smile and her optimism. She had believed in the mission, in him. She had died because she believed, and he had to carry that with him, too. What was the value of a single life? Varro didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. But as long as he was in command, he would keep asking the question. He would keep searching for meaning in the chaos, for purpose in the violence. Because if he allowed himself to become numb to the loss, then he had already lost. He rose from his chair and moved back to the viewport, the stars still shining cold and distant. Out there, in the vastness of space, his ship was a speck of dust. But here, within these walls, every life mattered. Even if the galaxy didn't care, he would. He would carry their names with him. Every one of them. Elias Varro stood in the dim light of the Aegis's command center, the hum of the ship's systems barely audible against the silence that filled the room. His gaze was fixed on the distant view of the colony. They had discovered a world shrouded in secrecy, tucked away from the eyes of both the Kyrans and, until now, the rest of humanity. It wasn't on any of their charts. No intelligence reports had ever suggested its existence. But there it was, a small, self-sufficient colony that had somehow survived, unnoticed, for centuries. A hidden enclave of humans who had slipped through the cracks of the Kyran Empire's control and chosen a different path. They've been here all this time, Reyes said softly, standing beside him. Her voice held a note of disbelief. Centuries. How could they remain hidden for so long? Varro didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the colony below, his thoughts racing. It was a mystery, but one that made a strange kind of sense. There had always been whispers, rumors of scattered human enclaves that had survived the fall of Earth's independence. Most dismissed them as legends, stories told to give hope where none remained. But this was real, and it complicated everything. Scans show minimal technology, Aaron haven't added from the navigation console. They're far more advanced than we expected, though they've deliberately avoided large-scale development. No signs of spacefaring vessels. They've survived by hiding, Varro muttered. They never wanted to be found. Haven nodded. Their isolation seems intentional. There's no evidence of contact with the Kyran Empire or with any other galactic force. They've stayed completely off the grid. Varro's hands tightened into fists behind his back. This colony represented something that had eluded humanity for so long: freedom. A small, fragile bubble of peace in a galaxy ruled by oppression. But how had they maintained it? What had they sacrificed to preserve their isolation? We need to talk to them, Reyes said, breaking the silence. Find out how they managed to stay hidden, and why they've stayed out of the fight. Varro remained silent, his jaw clenched. His instinct was to agree, to reach out to these lost brethren and ask for their help. They could be valuable allies in the coming war, but something held him back. There was a nagging doubt in his mind, a question that gnawed at him. Would they want to help? He turned to Reyes, his voice flat. Prepare a shuttle. We'll make contact. The shuttle's descent was smooth, the surface of the colony coming into clearer view as they approached. It was a verdant world, untouched by the scars of war. Rolling hills, lush forests, and clear rivers stretched out before them, a stark contrast to the burned landscapes and industrial sprawl that marked most of the galaxy's inhabited worlds. As the shuttle landed, Varro felt an odd sense of displacement. It was as though they had stepped into a different reality, a place where the wars and conflicts that defined the rest of the galaxy didn't exist. They don't even have defensive systems, Reyes muttered under her breath as the hatch opened. No signs of weapons or military infrastructure. Varro nodded. They've been hiding in plain sight. No need for defenses if no one knows you're here. As they stepped out of the shuttle, they were greeted by a small delegation of colonists. They were dressed simply, their clothes practical and unadorned. There were no formalities, no displays of authority. The leader of the group, a tall man with weathered features and sharp eyes, stepped forward to meet them. I am Caspian, the man said, his voice calm and measured. Welcome to Elysia. Varro studied the man for a moment. There was something in his demeanor, something quiet, but resolute. Caspian radiated a sense of peace, but beneath that, Varro sensed a strength born of hard choices. I'm Captain Elias Varro, he replied. We represent the Aegis of Dawn, a ship carrying the hopes of humanity's resurgence. Caspian's expression didn't change. I know why you've come. Varro raised an eyebrow. You do? Caspian nodded. You seek allies. You want us to join your fight against the Kyran Empire. There was no accusation in Caspian's tone, no anger or judgment. He simply stated the facts, as though he had anticipated this moment for years. It unsettled Varro. He had expected resistance, or at the very least, hesitation. But there was something deeper at play here. You've been hiding for centuries, Varro said. But the time for hiding is over. Humanity is fighting back. We can't do it alone. We need your help. Caspian regarded him with a steady gaze, and for a long moment, there was silence between them. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, thoughtful. Why? Varro blinked. Why what? Why do you fight? Caspian asked, his voice soft but firm. What is it you hope to achieve? Varro frowned, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. We fight for freedom, to reclaim what was taken from us. Caspian's eyes narrowed slightly, as if considering Varro's answer. Freedom. A noble ideal. But freedom from what, exactly? From the Kyrans? From oppression? Or from something deeper? Varro's frustration bubbled beneath the surface. He was here to secure allies. The Kyran Empire has ruled over us for 10,000 years. They took our home, our people. We fight to take it back. Caspian smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. And once you take it back, what then? Varro's jaw tightened. Then we rebuild. And how will you rebuild? Caspian pressed. With the same systems that led to humanity's downfall in the first place, with the same greed and ambition that allowed the Kyrans to conquer you. Varro took a step forward, his frustration now fully visible. We're not the same people we were 10,000 years ago. We've learned from our mistakes. Have you? Caspian asked, his voice still calm. Or are you simply repeating the same cycle, convinced that this time things will be different? Varro's fist clenched at his sides. This wasn't the conversation he had expected. He had thought they would be willing to fight, to join the cause without hesitation. But Caspian's words gnawed at him, forcing him to confront questions he wasn't prepared to answer. We don't have the luxury of standing on the sidelines, Varro said, his voice firm. If we don't fight, we'll be wiped out. The Kyrans won't stop until humanity is completely erased. Caspian's expression softened, but his gaze remained piercing. "And so you would drag us into your war? You would ask us to abandon the peace we've built, to throw away everything we've worked for, just to fight in a war that may never truly end?" Varro opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected them to resist so vehemently. They were human, just like him. Didn't they want the same thing? Didn't they want freedom? Caspian took a step closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "We chose a different path, Captain Varro. We chose to walk away from the cycle of violence, to live in harmony with each other and with this world. We've seen what war does, what it turns people into, and we will not go down that road again." Varro stared at him, his mind racing. This was a colony of humans, people who had once been part of the same struggle, who had endured the same oppression. But they had found another way, a way that didn't involve bloodshed. And now they were asking him to consider whether his own path was truly the right one. "Are you saying you won't help us?" Varro asked, his voice tight with frustration. Caspian shook his head slowly. "I'm saying we cannot fight for you, Captain. We've made our choice." Varro felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered by something deeper, a gnawing doubt that had been growing inside him ever since the battle with the Kyrans. Was he really doing the right thing? Was he dragging humanity down the same path that had led to their downfall in the first place? Reyes, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Caspian, if we fail, the Kyrans will come for you, too. You may be hidden now, but it's only a matter of time before they find you. What then?" Caspian turned his gaze to Reyes, his expression thoughtful. "We will deal with that if it comes, but we will not sacrifice our way of life for a war that is not ours to fight." Varro shook his head, his frustration now giving way to a deep sense of resignation. He had come here hoping to find allies, but instead, he had found something far more complicated, a people who had chosen peace over war, isolation over conflict. And now, he had to decide whether he would respect their choice or try to force them into a fight they didn't want. For a long moment, Varro said nothing. He simply stared at Caspian, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "I understand." Caspian nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "I hope you do, Captain. I truly hope you do." As they returned to the shuttle, Varro's thoughts were a storm of conflicting emotions. He had come to Elysia seeking allies, but what he had found instead was a mirror, one that reflected his own doubts and fears back at him. Reyes glanced at him as they boarded the shuttle. "What now?" Varro didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the peaceful world they were leaving behind, a world that had chosen a path he wasn't sure he could follow. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "We keep fighting." Reyes frowned. "Even without them?" Varro nodded slowly. "Even without them." But as the shuttle lifted off, Varro couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him, that the path ahead was no longer as clear as it had once seemed. In the end, what did it mean to fight for freedom, if the cost was losing the very thing they sought to protect? The shuttle's engines roared as they ascended into the sky, leaving the colony of Elysia behind, untouched and unchanged. The hum of the Aegis seemed louder in the quiet moments between missions, its subtle vibrations a reminder that even in stillness, the war loomed. Elias Varro leaned against the bulkhead of his quarters, staring at the empty space in front of him. His mind, however, was far from blank. His thoughts ran in circles, pulling him back to Elysia, to the conversation with Caspian, and to the gnawing doubt that had settled in his gut. He hadn't spoken much since their return from the colony, keeping to himself as the weight of command bore down on him. His crew had noticed, how could they not? But no one dared to confront him, not even Commander Layla Reyes, who had been at his side through it all. Except now. The soft hiss of the door opening drew his attention, and there she stood, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that belied the calm on her face. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. "You're avoiding me," she said quietly, stepping inside and allowing the door to close behind her. Varro didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure how to. He wasn't sure if he even knew how to put the storm of emotions inside him into words. So, he stayed silent, turning his gaze back to the far wall, where the holographic display of the ship's systems flickered quietly in the background. Reyes wasn't one to be deterred by silence. She crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, coming to stand beside him. For a moment, she simply stood there, her presence both familiar and yet foreign, as if the distance between them had grown in ways neither of them could quite understand. "This isn't working," she said after a while, her voice low but firm. Varro felt a tightness in his chest, but he didn't look at her. "What isn't?" "This," she gestured between them, "us." He finally turned to face her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you saying?" Reyes crossed her arms over her chest, her expression unreadable. "I'm saying that you're pulling away. You're shutting me out, shutting everyone out, and I'm trying to understand why." Varro let out a slow breath, the weight of her words settling over him. She wasn't wrong. He had been pulling away, but it wasn't something he had done intentionally. It had happened gradually, like a ship drifting off course without realizing it. "Layla, he started, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the doubt, the fear that had taken root inside him since Elysia? How could he admit that, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing? Reyes took a step closer, her voice softer now. "I know what you're feeling, Elias. I see it every day, in the way you carry yourself, the way you hesitate. It's the war. It's weighing on you, but you can't let it break you." Varro shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not just the war, Layla. It's everything. The Kyran, Elysia, the decisions I have to make every day. People are dying under my command, and for what? To fight a war that might never end, to become the very thing we're trying to destroy." Reyes frowned, her eyes searching his face. "What are you saying? You're not like them, Elias. You're not a tyrant." "Aren't I?" he shot back, his voice harsher than he intended. "Look at what we're doing. We're asking people to fight, to die, for a cause that might be just as flawed as the one we're fighting against. And what if we win? What then? Do we rebuild the same empire that collapsed under its own weight 10,000 years ago?" Reyes' jaw tightened, her stoic mask cracking slightly as she took in his words. She had always been the one to challenge him, to push him to confront the harder truths. But this was different. This wasn't about strategy or tactics. This was about the man he was becoming. "Elias, you're not the same as the leaders of the old empire," she said, her voice firm but tinged with emotion. "You care about humanity. You're fighting for our survival, not for power." Varro turned away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "And what if I lose myself along the way? What if this war turns me into something I never wanted to be?" Reyes stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Then I'll be here to remind you of who you are." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself feel the depth of the connection they shared. Layla Reyes had been his second in command for years, and in that time, their bond had grown beyond that of colleagues. But the war had strained that bond, pulling them in different directions, as the weight of command forced them to make choices neither of them wanted to face. "I'm afraid, Layla," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of what I might become." Rey's eyes softened, and she reached up to gently cup his face, her touch warm and grounding. "We're all afraid, Elias. But we can't let that fear control us. We can't let it define us." For a moment, they simply stood there, the tension between them shifting into something more fragile, more vulnerable. Varro's gaze lingered on her face, and he could see the weight she carried as well, the burden she kept hidden behind her stoic exterior. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Rey's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes betraying a flicker of emotion. "You won't." But there was a part of her that didn't believe that. Varro could see it in the way her eyes darted away, in the way her hand trembled slightly before she pulled it back. The war was changing them, both of them, and neither of them knew how to stop it. The next few days passed in a blur of briefings, reports, and preparations. The Aegis was en route to another Kyran-held system, a high-stakes mission that required their full attention. But despite the flurry of activity, Varro couldn't shake the tension between him and Reyes. Their conversations had grown shorter, more distant, as if they were both afraid to address the fracture that had formed between them. It wasn't until one night, late in the ship's cycle, that Varro found himself standing outside Reyes' quarters. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door control. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, or what he even planned to say. But he couldn't walk away. Not this time. When the door slid open, Reyes was standing at her small desk, reviewing tactical data on a holo screen. She looked up, surprised to see him there, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Varro stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft hiss. "We need to talk." Reyes sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "I figured this was coming." He moved closer, his eyes searching hers. "Things between us, they've changed." Reyes nodded, her gaze steady but guarded. "Yes, they have." "I don't want it to be like this," Varro said, his voice softening. "I don't want us to drift apart." Reyes let out a breath, crossing her arms over her chest. "Elias, we've been through so much. We've seen things that most people can't even imagine. And somewhere along the way, we stopped talking. Really talking." Varro swallowed hard, the truth of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. She was right. Somewhere along the way, they had let the war, the weight of command, and the fear of losing everything drive a wedge between them. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Reyes stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Neither do I, but we have to try. We owe it to ourselves." For a long moment, they simply stood there, the air between them charged with the weight of unspoken emotions. Varro could feel the walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble, the fear and doubt that had gnawed at him for so long finally surfacing. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for shutting you out. I didn't mean to." Reyes' expression softened, and she reached out to gently touch his arm. "I know, but you don't have to do this alone, Elias. You never did." Varro felt a lump rise in his throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself lean on her. He let himself feel the weight of her presence, the strength of the bond they had forged over years of battle and loss. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Reyes smiled softly, her hand resting on his cheek. "You won't." In that moment, the distance between them seemed to vanish, replaced by something fragile yet unbreakable. Their connection, strained as it was, had not been lost. It had simply been buried beneath the weight of war, waiting to be uncovered. And as they stood there, holding on to each other in the quiet of her quarters, Varro realized that, perhaps, the fight wasn't just against the Kyrans. It was against the darkness within themselves, the part of them that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. In the end, the greatest battle was not one fought with ships or weapons, but with a heart. And in that battle, they would either stand together or fall alone. The halls of the Aegis echoed with a distant hum of engines, strained and groaning under the damage from their last engagement. Every step Elias Varro took toward the bridge felt heavier than the one before. The ship, humanity's beacon of resistance, was wounded, and with it, so was he. The battle at Titan had pushed them beyond their limits. They had underestimated the Kyran Empire's response. What was once seen as an invincible machine of war was now showing cracks, literal and figurative. The cold air of the ship's corridors seemed to bite at him with every breath, a reminder of the thin line they walked between survival and extinction. On the bridge, the mood was somber. Officers worked quietly at their stations, faces etched with the same weight of exhaustion and uncertainty. The few exchanges that did happen were quick and professional. There was no space for idle conversation here. Each command was essential, each decision vital. Commander Layla Reyes stood at the center of the bridge, her eyes locked onto the various data streams and holographic projections in front of her. She was steady as always, but there was something in her posture that was different today. Elias could see the fatigue in the way her shoulders sagged ever so slightly, the tension in her jaw when she thought no one was looking. As Elias approached, Reyes turned to him. "We're looking at weeks for repairs, at best," she said without preamble. "The Kyrans knew exactly where to hit us." He nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say in response. The battle had been brutal, and the Kyrans had fought with a ferocity that caught even him off guard. They weren't treating this as a minor skirmish anymore. Humanity had officially become a threat, and they were responding with overwhelming force. "We're not ready," he finally admitted, his voice low enough that only Reyes could hear. "Not for what's coming." Reyes studied him, her expression unreadable. "We weren't ready when we started this, Varro. But we didn't have a choice then, and we don't have one now." Her words carried the hard truth he had been avoiding. There was no turning back, no retreat that could save them. They had thrown the first punch, and now they were in a fight for their survival, regardless of their readiness. The Kyran Empire would not stop until humanity was once again under their heel or worse, wiped out completely. "What's the situation with the crew?" he asked, needing to shift the conversation before the weight of it all crushed him. "Morale's low," she replied, her voice softer than before. "We lost a lot of people in the battle. They're starting to question if we can win this." He had expected as much. The losses had been staggering, both in terms of ships and personnel, and while the Aegis remained operational, its damage was severe enough to send a clear message to the rest of the fleet victory was far from assured. Elias ran a hand through his hair, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "We need to regroup, reassess. We can't keep pushing them like this." Reyes raised an eyebrow. "And what do we tell them? That we're backing down?" The idea of retreat gnawed at him. He had led them into this fight, believing in the strength of their convictions, in the idea that humanity had the right to stand on its own once again. But now, staring at the wreckage of his once formidable fleet, he wasn't sure anymore. "I'm not saying we back down," he said slowly, "but we need to be smarter. This fight isn't just about brute force. The Kyrans have us outgunned, outnumbered. We need to start thinking differently." For a moment, there was silence between them. Reyes studied him, her gaze intense. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I've always trusted your instincts, Elias, but we can't afford to second-guess ourselves now." "I'm not second-guessing," he replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I'm just trying to see the bigger picture." Reyes placed a hand on his arm, a rare gesture of comfort. "You've carried this burden long enough, but you're not in this alone. Let us carry some of it with you." Elias felt the knot in his chest loosen, if only slightly. Her words were grounding, pulling him back from the edge of despair. It was easy to forget, in the chaos of command, that he wasn't alone. He had a crew, a team, who believed in this fight as much as he did, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. As if on cue, the calm of the bridge was shattered by an incoming transmission. The comms officer turned to Varro and Reyes, her voice tight with tension. "Sir, we're picking up a distress signal from one of our outlying colonies. It's weak, but it's definitely human." Elias felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What colony?" "Stygian Roman 3, the officer replied. "It's on the edge of Kyran-controlled space. They were supposed to be hidden." "Supposed to be," Reyes muttered darkly. Elias stared at the holographic map, watching the red blip that marked the colony's location pulse weakly. Stygian Roman 3 was one of their more vulnerable outposts, a place they had hoped would go unnoticed by the Kyrans as they built up their resistance. But now it was clear that hope had been misplaced. The Kyrans had found them. "We can't respond," Reyes said quietly. "Not in our condition. Sending the Aegis would be suicide." "I know," Elias said, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. He knew what had to be done, but every fiber of his being recoiled from the idea of leaving people behind. "We'll send a scout ship," he said after a moment. "See what's happening out there, but we're not risking the fleet." Reyes nodded, her expression grim. "I'll see to it." As she turned to leave, Elias stayed behind, staring at the holographic map. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. They couldn't afford to lose Stygian Roman III, not so early in their rebellion. But they also couldn't afford to sacrifice the Aegis. The decisions were becoming harder, the stakes higher, and with every passing moment, the weight of his command grew heavier. For the first time in a long time, Elias found himself questioning if he was strong enough to bear it. As the holographic map flickered in the dim light of the bridge, Varro couldn't help but wonder, was it possible to lead without losing one's soul in the process? Could they resist the Kyrans without becoming the very thing they fought against? The line between survival and morality was becoming dangerously blurred, and the more Elias stared at the cold, pulsing light of Stygian Roman III, the more he realized that their fight wasn't just against an empire. It was against the darkness within them all. Elias stayed motionless on the bridge, gazing at the flickering holographic projection of Stygian Roman III. His thoughts churned restlessly, each one more urgent than the last. The silent hum of the ship around him contrasted sharply with the turmoil within. He didn't move as Reyes returned, her footsteps soft yet deliberate, the weight of command just as heavy on her shoulders. "They'll be launching the scout ship within the hour," she said, her voice low. "I handpicked the crew myself. They know the risks." Elias nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet. His mind drifted back to the lives at stake, people on the colony who had trusted him. People now waiting for a response, any sign that their cries for help had not gone unheard. The people who had fled to Stygian Roman III were part of a dream, the dream that humanity could live free from the iron grip of the Kyran Empire. They had believed that, under his leadership, there was hope. But now, with the Aegis weakened and the crew battered, that hope felt fragile. It dangled precariously, as if one wrong decision would snap the last thread holding them together. Reyes seemed to sense his hesitation. She moved closer, her voice firm. "This isn't on you, Elias. We've been up against impossible odds from the beginning. We knew the Kyrans wouldn't ignore us forever." He glanced at her, seeing the quiet strength in her eyes, but he couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at him. "Maybe we moved too fast," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Maybe we weren't ready for this fight." Reyes folded her arms, her gaze sharp. "Are you suggesting we should have stayed hidden? Waited until the Kyrans crushed us completely? We didn't choose this war, it was forced on us. We're doing what we have to do." He turned away from her, staring at the stars outside the bridge's viewport. The vastness of space always brought a strange sense of isolation, even aboard a ship filled with thousands of souls. The cold, distant stars felt indifferent to their struggles, their battles, their losses. He found no comfort in their silent watchfulness. "Reyes," he said quietly, still not facing her, "what if we're wrong?" There was a pause before she answered, her voice carefully measured. "About what?" "About everything. The rebellion, the lives we've sacrificed, the path we've chosen." His words came out slowly, each one weighed down by the enormity of the question. "What if this war doesn't lead to freedom? What if it just leads to more destruction, more tyranny? What if I'm no different than the Kyrans?" Reyes stepped forward, her boots making no sound on the metal floor. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch steady and reassuring. "You're not like them," she said firmly. "You've never been like them." "How do you know?" His voice was rough, laced with doubt. "Look at the choices we've made. Look at the lives we've taken." "You're fighting for something greater than yourself," she insisted. "The Kyrans, everything they do is to maintain their stranglehold on the galaxy, to keep others under their control. But you, Elias, you're trying to give humanity a future." He shook his head. "But at what cost?" Reyes was silent for a moment, considering her words carefully before responding. "Every war has its cost, Varro. You know that. But if we don't fight now, what kind of future do we leave for the generations to come? One where humanity is nothing but a footnote in Kyran history. Her words hit him hard. He knew she was right, at least on a rational level. The Kyrans had ruled over humanity for millennia, and their control had been absolute. To not fight back now would mean accepting subjugation, accepting the loss of their identity as a species. Yet, the moral weight of every death, every sacrifice, haunted him, reminding him that victory came at a price he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. "I don't want to become what I hate," he said quietly. "I don't want to lose myself in this fight." Reyes looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps it was a mix of sympathy and frustration. "We all have to make choices we don't want to make, Elias. But that's what leadership is. You don't get to choose the easy path, and you can't let the weight of your decisions paralyze you." He finally turned to look at her, seeing the resolve in her eyes, but also the weariness that mirrored his own. She was as tired as he was, worn down by the same battles, the same endless struggle. But there was something in her that he envied, something that allowed her to keep moving forward, even when everything seemed impossible. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do what?" "Keep going. Keep believing in this fight." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, as if searching for the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "I don't always believe in the fight, Elias, but I believe in you." The words hit him harder than he expected, cutting through the fog of doubt that had clouded his mind. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he saw something that had been missing: trust. She trusted him, even when he didn't trust himself. "I don't know if that's enough," he admitted, his voice raw. "It has to be," she said simply. "Because if we don't believe in something, then what's the point of any of this?" Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elias wanted to believe her, wanted to take solace in her unwavering faith in him. But the shadows of doubt still lingered at the edges of his mind, refusing to let go completely. "We'll find out soon enough," he said after a moment, his voice low. "One way or another." Reyes nodded, her gaze steady. "We will." As she turned to leave the bridge, Elias remained standing by the viewport, staring out into the infinite expanse of space. The stars glittered coldly in the distance, each one a reminder of how small they were in the grand scheme of things. And yet, despite their insignificance, they were fighting for survival, for freedom, for a future. But as the silent void stretched out before him, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that, in the end, they weren't just fighting against the Kyrans. They were fighting against something much more profound, something within themselves. The line between right and wrong, between freedom and tyranny, between hope and despair, it was all blurring, twisting into something unrecognizable. The soft hum of the Aegis seemed to amplify the tension that had been quietly building within its halls. Elias Varro stood alone in his quarters, the weight of his command pressing against him like a slow, crushing force. The events of the past weeks gnawed at him, an unrelenting echo in the depths of his mind. Every loss, every decision, every sacrifice circled him like specters, whispering their accusations in the silence. There had been whispers among the crew, whispers of doubt, of uncertainty. Questions that had once been murmured in passing were now spoken aloud, louder and more defiant. They had embarked on this war with hope, with a shared belief that they were fighting for something noble, something that mattered. But now, the certainty had faded, replaced by doubt, and the cracks in their unity were beginning to show. Elias turned from the viewport, his eyes scanning the room that felt less and less like his own. The distant stars provided little comfort, their indifferent light a reminder of how isolated they were, how insignificant their struggle might seem on a cosmic scale. And yet, they fought for survival, for identity, for a future. But whose future? Whose survival? The questions circled his mind like vultures. Were they fighting for humanity, or for his vision of it? Was the cost of this war already too high? A soft chime signaled the arrival of Reyes. She entered without waiting for an invitation, her expression uncharacteristically hard. There was something in her eyes, something different. She'd always been his anchor, his reminder of what they were fighting for. But now, even she seemed distant, as if the burden had become too much. "Things are falling apart, Elias," she said, her voice low but firm. "You can feel it, can't you? The crew, they're losing faith. And it's not just the pressure of battle, it's everything." He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "What are you saying, Reyes?" "I'm saying that people are beginning to wonder what we're really fighting for," she replied, her eyes locked on his. "We started this war with a clear purpose: freedom, justice. But now, it's getting harder to see the line between us and them." "The Kyrans?" Elias frowned. "We're nothing like them." "Aren't we?" she countered, stepping closer. "Look at the choices we've made, the lives we've taken, the allies we've lost. You talk about saving humanity, but every step we take seems to lead us down a darker path." Elias opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. He knew what she was saying, knew that the crew had their doubts. Hell, he had his doubts. But was there really another way? "You think I haven't thought about this," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Every day, I question what we're doing, whether it's worth it, whether any of this is worth it." Reyes crossed her arms, watching him closely. "And what answer do you come to?" Elias was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know if we're doing the right thing. But what choice do we have? We can't go back. Not now." "Maybe we don't need to go back," Reyes replied. "But maybe we need to ask ourselves what kind of future we're fighting for. Because right now, it feels like we're just stumbling forward, grasping at anything that might give us an edge. And in doing so, we're becoming something unrecognizable." Her words hit harder than he expected. Deep down, Elias knew she was right. There had been moments in recent weeks where he hadn't recognized his own decisions, hadn't recognized the man he'd become. The price of command, they said. The weight of leadership. But what if it was more than that? What if he was becoming exactly what he feared? The door to his quarters slid open again, and Dr. Aaron Haven entered, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested more than just concern. He was always the philosopher of the group, the one who questioned the deeper meanings behind their actions. "I couldn't help but overhear," Haven said, his voice calm but serious. "And Reyes is right. We're at a crossroads, Elias. You're at a crossroads." Elias gave a dry chuckle, devoid of humor. "Everyone seems to have an opinion on my leadership these days." "This isn't about leadership," Haven corrected, stepping forward. "This is about direction. You've always been the one driving this mission, Elias. You've given us purpose. But right now, we're drifting adrift in the storm of this war. We need to know, where are we heading? What are we aiming for?" Elias stared at the two of them, his closest confidants, the people who had stood by his side through everything, and realized how fragile their unity had become. The cracks were deepening, not just in the crew, but within himself. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his chest. "I wish I had an answer. I wish I could stand here and tell you that we're on the right path, that all of this makes sense. But the truth is, I don't know anymore. I don't know if we're doing the right thing." Haven's eyes softened, a rare moment of empathy breaking through his analytical demeanor. "Perhaps, Elias, the question isn't whether we're right or wrong. Perhaps the question is, can we live with the consequences of our choices? Can you?" The room fell into a heavy silence as Elias considered his words. Could he live with it? Could he live with the blood on his hands, the lives lost in the pursuit of something that felt increasingly abstract? "I don't know if I can," Elias whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "I don't know if I can live with any of this." Reyes stepped forward, her expression softening for the first time since she entered the room. "You're not alone in this, Elias. We all carry the weight of this war. But that's why we need to be clear on what we're fighting for. We can't just keep going because it's too late to turn back. We need something to believe in, something to hold on to." "And what is that, exactly?" Elias asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "What do we hold on to when everything is falling apart?" Reyes was silent for a moment. Then she met his gaze with an intensity that surprised him. "We hold on to each other." Elias blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of her answer. And yet, there was something in it, something that resonated with a part of him he'd been trying to ignore. They weren't just fighting for humanity's future. They were fighting for each other, for the bonds that had kept them going through the darkest moments. Haven nodded slowly, as if he, too, understood the truth in Ray's words. In the end, it's not about grand ideals or cosmic destinies. It's about the people standing next to you, the ones you're willing to fight for. That's what matters. The three of them stood there in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared understanding settling over them like a heavy blanket. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Elias felt a small spark of clarity. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe it was enough to fight for those who believed in him, to fight for the future they could build together. Elias took a deep breath, the weight on his chest lightening just a fraction. "We keep going," he said quietly, his voice steady. "But we do it together. No more doubts. No more hesitation." Ray's nodded, her eyes reflecting a quiet determination. Haven gave a small, approving smile. For the first time in weeks, Elias felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. The silence of the void had a weight to it. Not the absence of sound, but a presence. An oppressive stillness that wrapped itself around the hull of the Aegis as it drifted through a region of space that seemed older than memory itself. Elias Varro stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the dark expanse ahead. It was not the comforting black of the starry cosmos he had grown used to, but something deeper, more unsettling, an absence of light that seemed to absorb everything around it. "Captain," Dr. Aaron Haven's voice was low as he approached, his eyes locked on the data streaming across his terminal. "We've entered the coordinates, but I'm not sure we should be here." Elias glanced over at the scientist. Haven wasn't easily shaken, yet there was a palpable unease in his tone. It was something Elias himself had felt since they crossed the threshold into this region of space, a tension in the air, as if they were trespassing in a place they didn't belong. "Explain," Elias said, though he wasn't sure he needed an explanation. The air on the bridge had thickened with an almost suffocating atmosphere, a feeling that ran deeper than nerves. "We're detecting artifacts," Haven said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid the very utterance of the words would disturb something ancient and fragile. "Structures. They're scattered across the sector. Some appear to be dormant, but the energy readings, they're off the charts. These things, they're older than anything we've ever encountered." Elias turned fully toward the data stream. The readings were erratic, almost nonsensical, as if the sensors were struggling to make sense of what they were picking up. It was the first time since the war began that he felt truly unsettled. The Kyrans were a known threat, something tangible, even if they were dangerous. But this was different. This was alien in the truest sense of the word. Not just foreign to human understanding, but foreign to the very framework of existence they knew. "Can we confirm the source?" Elias asked, his voice steady though his mind raced with 100 questions. Haven shook his head. "Not exactly. It's not just one structure or artifact. It's scattered across the entire region. Some are as large as moons, others are more subtle, almost indistinguishable from debris. But they all share one thing: they're not of Kyran origin. These artifacts predate them by millennia, maybe even longer." "Any life signs?" Layla Reyes spoke up from her station, her usual composure tempered by a quiet wariness. "None," Haven replied. "Whatever made these, they're long gone, if they were ever alive in the way we understand life. But there's something else." Elias narrowed his eyes. "What?" Haven hesitated, glancing at the captain before continuing. "It's the pattern. The artifacts. They're arranged in a way that's not random. They're spread out, but they're connected, like a web across this part of space. It's as if they were left behind for a purpose, though what that purpose is, I can't begin to speculate." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. "Bring us in closer," he said, his voice firm despite the gnawing feeling in his gut. We need to understand what we're dealing with. The Aegis moved cautiously through the void, its engines thrumming softly as it closed the distance to one of the larger structures. The artifact loomed before them, a monolith of black stone, etched with markings that neither human nor Kyran language could decipher. It floated, weightless, yet it gave the distinct impression of something heavy, something grounded in an ancient, forgotten power. Reyes leaned forward, her eyes scanning the monolith with intensity. "Those markings, they're not just random carvings," she muttered. "They're deliberate. It's some kind of language, or maybe a warning." "A warning from who?" Elias asked, though the question felt rhetorical. Whatever had left this here, it was long gone, so ancient that its creators might have turned to dust before the first human ever walked on Earth. Haven's fingers moved deftly across his terminal as he ran a series of scans. "The material is unlike anything we've come across. It's absorbing our scans, like it's rejecting them. But the energy readings, it's almost as if the artifact is alive. Not in a biological sense, but it has a presence. It's not just sitting there, it's doing something." "What do you mean, doing something?" Reyes asked, her tone sharp. "It's interacting with space around it," Haven replied. "It's subtle, but this artifact is influencing the space-time fabric in its vicinity. It's like it's bending reality itself, but only in this small region." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. They were standing on the edge of something incomprehensible. The artifact wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that humanity didn't even know existed until now. "Captain," Reyes said, her voice softer now, "we need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with. This could be a trap, or worse. We might awaken something we can't control." Elias met her gaze, her usually unshakable confidence tempered by a fear she wouldn't voice outright. He understood her concern. There was a part of him that wanted to turn the ship around, to leave this place and never return. But another part of him, the part that had led him into this war, that had driven him to challenge the Kyran Empire, knew they couldn't turn back. Whatever this was, it was tied to something greater, something that might explain the mysteries of their universe in ways they could barely comprehend. "Prepare a probe," Elias ordered. "We'll send it in first. Let's see if we can get closer without risking the ship." Minutes later, the probe was deployed, its small, sleek form gliding toward the monolith. The crew watched in silence as the probe approached the artifact, data streaming back to the ship in rapid bursts. Haven monitored the feed closely, his brow furrowing as the information flowed in. It's responding to the probe," he said, almost in disbelief. "The energy readings are spiking. It's like the artifact is waking up." Elias felt his pulse quicken. "Pull the probe back." Before Haven could react, the probe's feed went dead. The monitors blinked with static, and then nothing. "Probe's offline," Haven said, his voice tight. "Whatever that thing is, it didn't like being prodded." Reyes cursed under her breath. "Now what?" Elias stood silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the dark monolith looming before them. There was no turning back now. Whatever they had stumbled upon, it was reacting to their presence. Whether it was hostile or simply ancient, its purpose remained unclear. But something told Elias this wasn't just another relic. This was a message left behind by beings whose reach extended far beyond the grasp of humanity or the Kyrans. "We're staying," Elias finally said, his voice resolute. "We need to understand what this is, what it means." Reyes shot him a look, but said nothing. She knew better than to argue when he had made up his mind. Haven glanced at the captain, then back at his monitors. "This region of space, it's a graveyard of civilizations. Whoever built these artifacts, they're long gone. But the remnants they left behind, they're telling us something. Something we're not ready to hear." Elias nodded, his thoughts lost in the vastness of the void. The universe had always seemed so vast, so indifferent. But now, standing on the precipice of something ancient and unknowable, he felt smaller than ever before. Whatever these artifacts were, they were not just markers of a forgotten past, they were pieces of a greater truth, one that stretched beyond the bounds of time, beyond the limits of human comprehension. As the Aegis floated in the darkness, surrounded by the silent monoliths, Elias couldn't help but wonder, were they meant to find this? Or had they stumbled upon something best left undisturbed? The stars, distant and cold, offered no answers. The bridge of the Aegis was cloaked in a tense quiet, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound filling the air. Elias Varro stood in front of the massive viewports, his gaze fixed on the distant form of the Kyran flagship that hung in the void like a predator. It wasn't a warship in the traditional sense, it didn't bristle with guns or gleam with armor like the ships Elias had come to expect in battle. Instead, it exuded a sense of command, as though its very presence in the blackness of space was enough to demand attention. The crew of the Aegis waited, their breath held, as the moments ticked by. They had fought, bled, and lost too much to turn back now, and yet, here they stood on the precipice of something they couldn't quite define. The Kyran Emperor had sent a message, a direct communication, not just to the Aegis, but to Elias himself. "Elias, he's waiting," Layla Reyes said quietly from her station beside him, her eyes scanning his face for a reaction. Elias gave a curt nod, his mind awash with the weight of the moment. They were no longer playing by the rules of simple warfare. This was something else, something far deeper than just a fight for territory or survival. The Emperor had made it personal, in a way that Elias hadn't anticipated. He turned to Dr. Haven, who had been monitoring the energy signatures of the Kyran fleet with uncharacteristic solemnity. "What's the status on their end?" Elias asked, his voice measured but betraying a deep sense of unease. Haven tapped a few keys, his eyes glued to the streams of data. "They're holding position. No signs of movement, no indications they're preparing for a full assault. It's like they're waiting." Elias nodded, turning back to the viewport. The Kyrans could destroy them in an instant. He knew that. Everyone on the Aegis knew that. Their technological advancements, as impressive as they were, couldn't match the sheer might of the Kyran Empire. Yet the Emperor had stayed his hand. Why? "They want something," Elias muttered under his breath. The realization gnawed at him, an unsettling thought taking shape in his mind. This wasn't about dominance, at least not in the way he had always assumed. The Emperor had the power to wipe humanity from the stars, and yet here they were alive, waiting. It wasn't power the Emperor sought. It was control over something much larger than just this battle, this rebellion. Reyes shifted beside him. "We should hear him out, Elias. Whatever this is, it's more than just a fight for survival now. This is about something bigger." Elias let her words hang in the air, his mind churning. Every instinct told him to reject the Emperor's offer before it was even made. This was the enemy, the tyrant who had subjugated humanity for centuries, who had crushed countless worlds beneath his heel. But if they didn't listen, if they continued to fight, what would be the cost? "Open the channel," Elias ordered, his voice heavy with resignation. It wasn't an act of surrender, but rather a decision to face whatever came next head-on. The comms officer complied, and the air in the room seemed to change as the connection was established. A hologram flickered to life in the center of the bridge, and there, in shimmering light, stood the figure of the Kyran Emperor. The Emperor's appearance was not what Elias had expected. He didn't wear the ceremonial garb of a ruler, nor did he carry himself with the air of someone who needed to assert their authority. His robes were simple, almost understated, and his face was calm, inscrutable. It was as though he existed outside of time, untouched by the chaos and destruction that had marked their war. "Elias Varro," the Emperor said, his voice smooth and deliberate, resonating through the bridge with an authority that didn't need to be earned. "You've come far." Elias clenched his fists at his sides, holding back the torrent of emotions that threatened to break through. "We're still here," he replied, his voice steady but hard. "That counts for something." The Emperor inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging the truth of Elias's words. "Indeed, you fought well, and your people have shown resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. But you must know, Elias, that this fight cannot continue. You cannot win." Elias felt a surge of anger rising in his chest, but he held it down. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his tone edged with bitterness. "You think I don't know what we're up against?" The Emperor's eyes met Elias's, unwavering. "I believe you do, but I also believe you misunderstand what is at stake here." Silence fell over the bridge, the weight of the Emperor's words hanging between them like a sword ready to drop. "You believe you are fighting for freedom," the Emperor continued, "for the survival of your species. But this is not a battle for survival, Elias. It is a battle for something far more fundamental." Elias's brow furrowed, confusion seeping into his thoughts. "What do you mean?" The Emperor took a slow breath, his gaze never leaving Elias's. "The fate of your kind does not hinge on victory or defeat in this war. It is already determined by forces far beyond your control. I am offering you a choice, Elias. A choice that will determine the future of your people not just in this moment, but for all time." A coldness settled over Elias. The Emperor's words weren't a threat, but a promise. He was offering something beyond the battlefield, beyond the politics and violence that had defined this war. He was offering something far more dangerous, an end. "What is this choice?" Elias asked, his voice tight. The Emperor's gaze softened slightly, as though he pitied the man standing before him. "You can end this now. Surrender your rebellion, and I will ensure the survival of your people. They will not be destroyed, nor will they be enslaved. They will be allowed to exist, to thrive, under my protection." Elias felt the bile rise in his throat. Protection. It was a word that carried with it the weight of submission, the promise of subjugation without the chains. "And if I refuse?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. The Emperor's eyes darkened. "Then your people will die. Not just in this war, but in the wars to come. I will see to it that humanity is erased from the stars. You will be nothing more than a memory, a footnote in the history of this galaxy." Elias's heart pounded in his chest. The enormity of the choice weighed down on him, pressing into his very soul. He could end this war now, save the lives of billions, but at what cost? Was it truly better to live under the shadow of the Kyran Empire than to die fighting for freedom? Was survival worth the price of submission? Layla's voice cut through the silence, soft but firm. "Elias, whatever you choose, we'll follow you. But know this: some things are worth more than survival." Elias turned to her, his eyes locking with hers. In that moment, he saw the truth of her words reflected in her gaze. Survival wasn't enough. To live without freedom, without the right to choose their own destiny, was not life at all. He turned back to the Emperor, his decision solidifying within him like iron. "I won't surrender," Elias said, his voice steady. "We won't live on our knees." The Emperor's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something disappointment, perhaps. Or maybe it was something else, something Elias couldn't quite define. "Very well," the Emperor said, his voice soft but filled with finality. "You've made your choice." The hologram flickered and vanished, leaving the bridge in a heavy silence. Elias stood there for a long moment, the weight of his decision settling over him like a shroud. He had chosen freedom, but at what cost? The future loomed before him, uncertain and filled with the shadows of war and death. But in that uncertainty, there was also hope, a hope that humanity could carve its own path, even in the face of impossible odds. As the stars stretched out before them, cold and indifferent, Elias knew one thing for certain: the fight was far from over, but it was a fight worth having. The bridge of the Aegis was a crucible of anticipation, the crew's collective breath creating an invisible tension that seemed to grip the very air. Elias Varro remained at the forefront, his eyes unwavering as he observed the imposing form of the Kyran flagship. It was not merely a vessel, but a symbol of the Empire's omnipresence, a monolith suspended in the void, its dark surface a mirror to the uncertain future that lay before them. The silence was thick, pressing against Elias's eardrums with an almost tangible weight. Each tick of the ship's chronometer felt like an echo of the decisions yet to come. This was no longer a skirmish, a clash of military might. It had transcended into a battleground of ideals and destiny. The Kyran Emperor's message had stripped away any pretense of normalcy, reducing their existence to a choice that would define their place in history. Layla Reyes, standing by Elias's side, watched him with a mixture of concern and respect. Her stoic facade belied the storm of emotions she must have felt. The horrors they had witnessed, the personal losses they had endured, now collided with the monumental decision before them. Her presence was a quiet anchor amidst the tempest of Elias's thoughts. "Elias," she said, her voice carrying the weight of shared experience, "we've come this far together. Whatever happens next, we face it as one." Elias turned to her, searching her face for any sign of doubt or fear. Instead, he found a determination that mirrored his own. Yet, this was no ordinary moment of solidarity. It was a culmination of countless battles and sacrifices that had led them to this singular confrontation. Dr. Aaron Haven, usually lost in the labyrinth of his own calculations, now stood with a rare sense of gravity. His eyes, normally fixed on screens, were now focused on Elias. The Emperor's offer isn't just about this war. It's about the very essence of who we are and what we're willing to sacrifice for our ideals. Elias nodded, absorbing Haven's words. They echoed his own internal conflict, a conflict between the survival of his people and the cost of that survival. The Emperor's offer was a cruel twist of fate, presenting a choice that was anything but clear-cut. The comms officer's voice broke through the silence, announcing the Emperor's hologram was ready to appear. Elias braced himself, knowing that whatever was to come next would likely shatter any semblance of normalcy they had left. The hologram flickered to life, casting an ethereal glow across the bridge. The Emperor's figure was imposing, but not through sheer presence alone. There was a serene, almost dispassionate quality to him that defied the grandeur of his status. His robes, though regal, were understated, and his expression bore a calmness that suggested he was both aware of and indifferent to the chaos unfolding around him. "Elias Varro," the Emperor's voice resonated through the chamber, steady and devoid of any hint of emotion. "You have demonstrated considerable fortitude in your campaign. Yet, your understanding of the stakes remains incomplete." Elias felt a pang of frustration. He had braved countless battles, endured immeasurable loss, and still, the Emperor's words seemed to undermine everything he had fought for. "I know what is at stake," Elias replied, his voice measured despite the turmoil within. "We fight for freedom, for a future where we are not ruled by tyranny." The Emperor's gaze was unyielding. Freedom is a concept easily spoken but challenging to grasp in its entirety. You believe that by rejecting my offer, you assert your independence. Yet, what you fail to see is the price of that independence. Elias's anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. "And what price is that? What do you offer in exchange for our surrender?" The Emperor's response was almost serene. "I offer preservation. If you choose to end this rebellion, your people will be spared the total annihilation that awaits them should you persist. This is not a mere battle, Elias. It is a question of existential survival." Elias's mind reeled. Preservation under the Kyran rule meant living in the shadows of their oppressors, existing without the right to self-determination. The thought of surrendering, of trading their fight for a semblance of safety, was almost unbearable. Layla stepped closer to Elias, her voice a whisper but laden with conviction. "Think carefully. Your decision will shape not just our future, but the very essence of who we are as a species." Elias's thoughts raced. His memories of the battles fought, the lives lost, and the dreams deferred collided with the harsh reality of their current predicament. The decision before him was not merely strategic, it was existential. It questioned the nature of humanity itself, whether to endure under the yoke of tyranny or to face the darkness with the hope of forging their own path. The Emperor's voice cut through Elias's internal turmoil. "Make your choice, Elias. Surrender and protect what remains of your people, or continue this futile resistance and consign them to obliteration." The room fell silent as Elias grappled with the enormity of the decision. The weight of his command, the sacrifices of his crew, the hopes of his people, all these factors converged into a singular, defining moment. Elias looked at the Emperor, his resolve hardening. "I refuse to surrender. We will fight, not just for survival, but for the right to define our own destiny. If that means facing obliteration, then we face it with the knowledge that we chose our own path." The Emperor's expression remained inscrutable, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. "So be it," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a cosmic verdict. "You have made your choice." The hologram faded, leaving Elias standing in the oppressive silence of the bridge. The crew, sensing the gravity of the moment, waited for their leader's next move. The decision had been made, but the consequences were still unfolding. The bridge of the Aegis remained a crucible of anticipation, the crew's collective breath creating an invisible tension that seemed to grip the very air. Elias Varro stood at the forefront, the vast expanse of space stretching before him like an impenetrable veil. The Kyran flagship loomed ominously in the distance, its dark, sleek form casting an imposing shadow over the scene. The sight of it was a constant reminder of the stakes at hand and the gravity of the decision awaiting him. Layla Reyes, who had been his unwavering ally through countless battles, stood beside him. Her gaze was fixed on the holographic display, but her mind seemed far away. The weight of their shared experiences, the echoes of their past encounters, and the burdens of command were etched into her features. Despite her stoic demeanor, there was an unspoken depth to her concern, a fear that Elias's decisions could lead them all to ruin. The comms officer's voice cut through the tension, announcing the arrival of the Kyran Emperor's hologram. Elias steeled himself as the projection flickered into existence, casting a cold, blue light across the bridge. The Emperor's image was a study in serene authority, his posture and expression calm and calculated. The contrast between his composed demeanor and the chaos that surrounded them was jarring. "Elias Varro," the Emperor's voice resonated, devoid of warmth or sympathy. "You stand at the precipice of a monumental choice. Your actions will determine not only the fate of your people, but also the course of this galactic struggle." Elias felt a surge of anger. He had led his people through countless trials, faced insurmountable odds, and still, the Emperor spoke with a detachment that seemed to undermine their efforts. "We've fought too hard to be faced with a choice that will either condemn us to eternal subjugation or allow us to define our own future." The Emperor's gaze was unyielding. "The future you seek is fraught with peril. Surrendering now would spare your people from annihilation. Persisting in your rebellion, however, will only ensure their destruction. This is not merely a matter of strategy, but of existence itself." Layla moved closer to Elias, her voice a low murmur of support. "Remember why we fight. We're not just fighting for survival, we're fighting for the right to shape our own destiny." Elias's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. The losses they had endured, the sacrifices made, and the dreams of freedom all seemed to collide in a single, overwhelming moment. Dr. Aaron Haven, usually absorbed in his calculations, now stood with an intensity that was rare for him. His eyes, normally focused on data and projections, were locked onto Elias. "The Emperor's offer isn't merely about this battle. It's a test of our values and our vision for the future." Elias nodded, absorbing Haven's insight. The decision before him was more than just a choice of tactics. It was a fundamental question of purpose. The very nature of their rebellion, the reasons for their fight, and the essence of their humanity were all at stake. The Emperor's hologram flickered slightly, a reminder of the ephemeral nature of their dialogue. "The fate of your people hinges on your decision. Surrender, and you preserve what remains of your society. Persist, and you risk the total annihilation of your race." Elias's heart ached with the weight of his responsibility. The thought of surrender was almost as unbearable as the prospect of extinction. The cost of rebellion was steep, but the cost of submission was a loss of everything they had fought for. The bridge was silent as Elias wrestled with his decision. Each crew member was acutely aware of the monumental stakes, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. The quiet hum of the ship seemed to amplify the tension, the very air thick with anticipation. Elias turned to Layla, his eyes searching for some sign of clarity amidst the chaos. "What do we stand for if we surrender? Are we simply trading one form of tyranny for another? or are we fighting for a vision of something greater? Layla's gaze met his, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and resolve. We fight for the right to choose our own path. If we surrender, we lose more than just a battle. We lose our identity, our purpose, and the future we fought so hard to build. Dr. Heaven spoke again, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. History has shown that freedom is often costly, but it is the pursuit of that freedom that defines who we are. The Emperor's offer is not just a tactical choice. It's a reflection of the broader struggle between freedom and oppression. Elias's mind raced as he contemplated the ramifications of their choices. The stakes were not just about the immediate survival of his people, but about the legacy they would leave behind. The struggle was not merely against an external enemy, but against the internal fears and doubts that threatened to undermine their resolve. The Emperor's voice cut through the silence once more. Your decision, Elias Varro, will shape not only the future of your people, but the course of history itself. Choose wisely. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his command more acutely than ever before. The decision was not just about strategy or survival. It was about the fundamental principles that define their struggle. The future of humanity was at stake, and he had to make a choice that would either preserve their dignity or consign them to a future of subjugation. I choose to fight, Elias declared, his voice resolute. We will face the consequences of our decision, but we will do so with the knowledge that we chose our own path. The Emperor's image remained impassive, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a recognition of the gravity of Elias's choice. Then prepare for the repercussions of your decision. The consequences will be both profound and far-reaching. As the hologram faded, Elias was left standing at the helm of his ship, the weight of his choice heavy on his shoulders. The future was uncertain, a canvas yet to be painted with the colors of their decisions. The universe, with its indifferent vastness, seemed to challenge them to rise above their constraints and embrace their destiny. The Aegis of Dawn drifted through the cold, desolate expanse of space, the crew's faces dimmed by the stark blue glow of the navigational screens. The ship's recent damage from the confrontation with a Kyran Emperor had been repaired, but the toll on morale was apparent. The tension within the vessel was a living, breathing entity, feeding on the uncertainty that had settled over the crew like a shroud. Elias Varro stood in his quarters, gazing out at the endless void through the ship's viewport. The stars seemed distant, indifferent to the turmoil unfolding within and without. He was lost in thought, grappling with the implications of his decision to continue the fight against the Kyran Empire. Each passing moment was a reminder of the high cost of defiance, but the weight of responsibility was more than just a burden. It was a fundamental challenge to his very being. The quiet hum of the ship's systems was occasionally interrupted by the soft chime of an incoming message. It was from Dr. Heaven, whose voice, though calm, carried an undercurrent of urgency. Captain Varro, we've intercepted communications indicating significant unrest within the Kyran Empire. I believe it warrants your immediate attention. Elias's mind raced as he processed Heaven's words. The Kyran Empire, an entity they had always seen as monolithic and unyielding, was now revealing cracks in its facade. The very nature of their enemy was shifting, and with it, the strategic landscape. When Elias arrived in the operations center, Heaven was already at his station, surrounded by a matrix of holographic displays. The data on the screens were fragmented, but a pattern was emerging. Dissident factions within the Kyran Empire were making moves that could destabilize their control. The information was complex and often veiled in ambiguity, but it was clear that the Empire was not as unified as it had appeared. Look at this, Heaven said, pointing to a series of intercepted messages. These are communications between high-ranking Kyran officials and various dissident groups. There's a significant push for reform within their ranks, and it seems some factions are actively seeking to overthrow the Emperor. Elias's gaze shifted from the data to Heaven's face. Are these factions capable of making a substantial impact? Can we use this to our advantage? Heaven hesitated before responding. It's difficult to gauge their strength precisely. Some factions are well organized and have substantial resources, while others are more fragmented. However, the fact that there's internal discord is undeniable. It could provide us with an opportunity, but it also introduces a new layer of complexity to our situation. Layla Reyes entered the room, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. What are we dealing with here? Are we talking about a full-scale civil war within the Empire? Haven shook his head. Not necessarily. There's unrest, but the Empire's power structure remains formidable. The dissidents have influence, but the Empire's core might still hold strong. The shifting alliances within their ranks could create openings for us, but we must proceed with caution. Elias ran a hand through his hair, the implications of the new information weighing heavily on him. We need to understand this internal conflict better. If the Empire is fracturing, we must know how to exploit it without overextending ourselves. As the crew worked to decode the complex web of Kyran politics, Elias found himself contemplating the nature of power and its inherent instability. The Kyran Empire, with its seemingly omnipotent control, was not immune to the same forces of decay and discord that plagued every governing body. The very foundation of their enemy's strength was built on a fragile consensus, susceptible to the same internal strife that could undermine any regime. The following days were spent in a flurry of activity. Intelligence reports were analyzed, and diplomatic channels were established with the dissident factions. Elias and his team sought to forge connections, offering support to those within the Empire who sought to challenge the status quo. The aim was to catalyze the internal dissent without aligning too closely with any single faction, ensuring that they remained a catalyst for change rather than a pawn in a larger struggle. The complexities of the situation became apparent as Elias and Layla delved deeper into the murky world of Kyran politics. The dissidents were not a homogeneous group. They had different motivations, ideologies, and goals. Some sought democratic reforms, while others aimed for a complete overthrow of the existing order. Navigating this web of conflicting interests required delicate diplomacy and a keen understanding of the power dynamics at play. During one late-night strategy session, Elias and Layla reviewed a series of intercepted communications that revealed the intimate details of the Kyran power struggle. The messages were laced with vitriol and ambition, painting a picture of an empire on the brink of a potentially cataclysmic upheaval. Layla, her eyes tired but focused, read aloud from one of the documents. This message suggests that there are factions within the Kyran military that are prepared to stage a coup. They're disillusioned with the Emperor's leadership and are seeking external support to strengthen their position. Elias's gaze was intense as he absorbed the information. If we can support these factions, it could create enough turmoil to weaken the Empire significantly. But we must be cautious. Supporting one faction might alienate others or escalate the conflict in unpredictable ways. Layla nodded. It's a delicate balance. We need to ensure that our involvement is seen as a neutral force for change rather than an act of aggression that could unite the factions against us. As the hours ticked by, the strategic implications of their new approach began to crystallize. Elias and his team crafted a series of carefully worded communications to the dissident factions, offering resources and strategic support while emphasizing their neutrality. The goal was to foment change within the Empire without becoming entangled in its internal conflicts. The political intrigue of the Kyran Empire mirrored the moral ambiguities faced by humanity. The dissidents, once seen as potential allies, were revealed to be as complex and morally nuanced as the Empire itself. They were not simply heroes of a rebellion, but individuals with their own agendas, flaws, and desires for power. Elias found himself reflecting on the nature of power and corruption. The Kyran Empire's internal decay was a stark reminder that no regime, no matter how seemingly invincible, was immune to the forces of change and decay. The same dynamics that had led to the Empire's dominance were now driving its potential downfall. It was a poignant lesson in the fragility of power and the inherent instability of all systems of control. In a rare moment of quiet, Elias and Layla stood together in the ship's observation deck, watching the distant stars twinkle in the void. The silence was filled with a shared sense of contemplation, a space where the weight of their decisions and the complexity of their mission could be felt in full. Layla broke the silence, her voice soft but resolute. What does it mean to be on the right side of history when the lines between good and evil are so blurred? We're fighting against an empire that's failing, but the forces within it are just as flawed as those we oppose. Elias's gaze was fixed on the stars, his thoughts drifting to the larger questions of morality and destiny. Perhaps it's not about being on the right side of history, but about striving to make choices that reflect our values and principles. The fight isn't just against the Empire, it's about defining who we are and what we stand for. Their conversation was a reflection of the broader struggle that lay ahead, a struggle not just for survival, but for a meaningful and just future. The Aegis of Dawn floated through the inky blackness of space, its hull scarred from the recent battles, its systems strained to their limits. In the dimly lit corridors, the crew moved with a somber determination, their faces etched with the fatigue of a war that seemed to stretch into eternity. The ship was a symbol of humanity's struggle, but inside its metal confines, the true cost of this struggle was becoming all too personal. Elias Varro stood in the command center, staring at the flickering holographic displays that mapped their current location. The vastness of space seemed more daunting than ever, a constant reminder of the isolation and the stakes of their mission. The recent loss of several crew members had cast a long shadow over him, but it was the fear of losing more, especially Layla, that gnawed at him the most. Layla Reyes had become more than a colleague. She was a confidante, a source of strength, and, in recent weeks, something much deeper. Their relationship, forged in the fires of war, had been a source of solace and conflict alike. But now, as the tension reached its zenith, the bond they shared was about to be tested in the most devastating way possible. The alert came suddenly, a breach in the ship's outer defenses. The Kyran Empire had launched a surprise assault, exploiting a vulnerability the Aegis had been unable to patch in time. The attack was precise and ruthless, targeting the ship's power core, which was crucial for their continued operation. Elias's heart raced as he scrambled to assess the damage. The situation was critical. The power core was failing, and if it went offline, the Aegis would be left adrift, its systems unresponsive and its crew vulnerable. The battle for survival was not just against the Kyran forces outside, but against the creeping darkness within the ship. In the midst of the chaos, Layla appeared at his side, her face a mask of determination. "We need to stabilize the core, or we'll lose everything," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. Elias nodded, his mind racing. "We've got to get to the core room. I'll lead the way." As they made their way through the ship, the sounds of battle echoed through the corridors. The alarms blared, and the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated, making their progress more difficult. Despite the chaos, Layla remained calm, her eyes focused on the task at hand. Her presence was a beacon of strength, but Elias could see the strain etched on her face. Reaching the core room, they found it in a state of disarray. Sparks flew from damaged circuits, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning electronics. The power core was on the verge of a critical failure, its energy levels fluctuating erratically. Layla moved swiftly, her hands working with practiced precision to try and stabilize the core. Elias assisted her, his actions mirroring hers as they fought against time and technology. The task was monumental, and their combined efforts seemed to momentarily stem the tide of impending disaster. But then, as the situation grew increasingly dire, Layla's gaze shifted to a small, flickering panel on the far side of the room. It displayed a readout that indicated an imminent meltdown, an irreversible cascade that would destroy the Aegis and everything aboard. "This is bad," Layla said, her voice calm but tinged with an edge of resignation. "We can't fix this in time. The core's containment field is failing, and we need to stabilize it manually." Elias's heart sank as he understood the gravity of her words. "There must be another way. We can't just—" "There isn't time," Layla interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "We need to manually override the containment field. It's the only chance we have." Elias's eyes locked with hers, a torrent of emotions flooding through him. The reality of their situation hit him with a brutal force. Layla was offering her life to save the ship, to save the crew, and to ensure their survival. The enormity of her sacrifice was overwhelming. "No," Elias said, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "There has to be another way." Layla shook her head, her expression resolute. "We both know there isn't. The core's instability is too great. I can override the field, but I'll need to stay behind. It's the only way to buy enough time for the crew to escape." Elias reached out to her, his hands trembling. "Layla, please. We can find another solution." But Layla was already moving, her actions swift and purposeful. She initiated the manual override sequence, her fingers flying over the controls. The room was filled with the ominous whine of the failing power core, the sound growing louder as the seconds ticked away. Elias watched, powerless to stop the inevitable. He could see the resolve in Layla's eyes, a mixture of courage and resignation. Her sacrifice was both a testament to her strength and a profound personal loss. As the override sequence began, Layla took a deep breath, her gaze softening as she looked at Elias one last time. Tell them we fought for something real, that we believed in a future worth fighting for." Her voice was barely audible over the cacophony of alarms and failing systems. Elias's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, his throat constricted with grief. "I will, I promise." With one final, determined look, Layla finished the override and initiated the final sequence. The containment field stabilized, buying the Aegis the precious minutes needed for the crew to escape. But as the power core's energy surged through the system, it became clear that her time was running out. Layla's figure was silhouetted against the glowing containment field, her sacrifice etched into the very fabric of their struggle. The power core stabilized, but the room was now engulfed in a blinding light. Elias turned away, his heart breaking as he watched the door close behind him, sealing Layla's fate. In the aftermath, the crew regrouped, their faces a mixture of relief and mourning. The Aegis was safe for now, but the price of their survival was a profound personal loss. Elias was left to grapple with the void left by Layla's absence, her sacrifice a heavy burden on his soul. The corridors of the Aegis of Dawn were quieter now, the frantic scurrying of the crew replaced by a somber silence. The ship's systems hummed with a subdued rhythm, their once boisterous alarms now a background murmur that echoed the gravity of their situation. The crew, though safe from immediate peril, was left to confront a profound sense of loss, as the sacrifice of one of their own had become a painful reality. Elias Varro wandered through the dimly lit passageways, each step echoing his inner turmoil. His mind replayed the harrowing moments in the core room, the sight of Layla's unwavering resolve and the finality of her sacrifice. The weight of her loss was a tangible presence, an emotional gravity that pulled him deeper into reflection. As he reached the bridge, the command center was quiet, its usual bustle replaced by a subdued air of mourning. The holographic displays, once vibrant with data and tactical overlays, now flickered with a somber tone, casting a muted light over the faces of the remaining crew. They were a fractured family, bound together by shared struggle, and now united in their grief. Commander Layla Reyes had been more than a mere officer. She had been Elias's anchor in the storm. Her unwavering dedication, her strength, and her love had been a source of immense comfort amidst the chaos of war. Now, with her absence, Elias felt adrift, a captain without his guiding star. The bridge's viewport offered a view of the cold expanse of space, a realm of distant stars and cosmic silence. Elias stood before it, the darkness of space a mirror to the emptiness he felt inside. The stars, indifferent and distant, seemed to mock the personal drama unfolding aboard the Aegis. Their cold light was a stark reminder of the vastness of the universe and the smallness of individual lives. The crew, though resilient, bore the mark of their loss. Faces that had once been full of determination now showed signs of strain. They moved with a subdued purpose, their conversations hushed and their eyes reflecting a shared sorrow. Elias saw their silent struggle and felt the weight of leadership more acutely than ever. In the aftermath of the crisis, the ship's operations continued, but the atmosphere was heavy with a shared grief. The crew's efforts to stabilize the ship and repair the damage were driven by a mix of duty and mourning. The technical tasks seemed almost trivial compared to the emotional task of coming to terms with Layla's sacrifice. Elias knew he had to address the crew, to offer them words of comfort and hope. But as he stood before them, he found himself at a loss for words. The emotional chasm left by Layla's death was a gulf that words seemed inadequate to bridge. He looked out at the faces before him, each one reflecting a fragment of the pain and loss that had become their shared reality. He cleared his throat, his voice breaking slightly as he began to speak. "We've faced many challenges, and we've endured much together. But today, we've lost someone dear to us. Layla Reyes gave everything to save us, to give us a chance to continue this fight. Her sacrifice is a testament to her courage, her love, and her unwavering belief in our cause." His words were met with a solemn silence. The crew's eyes were fixed on him, their expressions a mixture of grief and respect. The emotional weight of his words was palpable, each sentence carrying the burden of their collective loss. Elias continued, his voice steadying as he spoke. "In her final moments, Layla reminded us of the true cost of our struggle. We fight not just for survival, but for something greater, a future where her sacrifice means something. We must honor her memory by continuing the fight with the same courage and conviction she showed us." As he spoke, Elias's mind drifted back to the moments he had shared with Layla. Her laughter, her quiet strength, the way she had always managed to find a glimmer of hope even in the darkest times. Her loss was a profound void, one that he could never fill. But it was also a call to action, a reminder of the personal stakes that underscored their mission. The bridge fell silent as Elias finished speaking, the crew absorbing his words and the gravity of their situation. They were left to grapple with their own emotions, to find solace and strength in each other as they faced the uncertain future ahead. Later that night, Elias returned to his quarters, the silence of the ship echoing his internal desolation. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow of the control panels offering little comfort. He sat at his desk, the personal effects of his own life, a photograph of his family, a few mementos from Earth providing a stark contrast to the cosmic vastness he faced daily. The photograph of his family, taken years before the fall of Earth, was a reminder of what he had lost. He stared at their smiling faces, their warmth a distant memory. The contrast between their life and his current reality was a painful reminder of the sacrifices made and the path that had led him to this point. The vastness of space, with its indifferent stars and boundless darkness, seemed to reflect the enormity of these questions. The universe, in its cold and distant expanse, offered no easy answers. It was a realm of existential contemplation, where the significance of individual lives was often overshadowed by the vast sweep of cosmic forces. As Elias sat alone, the echoes of Layla's sacrifice reverberated through his mind. The Aegis of Dawn floated in the shadow of a massive Kyran fleet, the cold void of space filled with the energy of an impending battle. Every crew member on board felt the tension, an almost tangible weight that pressed down on them like a suffocating presence. This was it, the final stand. There was no room for error, no margin for retreat. Humanity's future hinged on what happened in the next few hours, and Elias Varro was all too aware of the burden that lay on his shoulders. He stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the holographic display that projected the fleet positions before him. The Kyran warships, sleek and vast, dwarfed the human vessels in both size and number. Their formations were precise, like a predator circling its prey. On the other side, the Aegis and the scattered remnants of humanity's resistance fleet stood ready, small, battered, but not broken. Elias's fingers clenched tightly around the railing, the weight of his responsibility heavier than ever. Every decision from here on out would be a calculated risk. The Kyran forces were not just formidable in strength. They were led by some of the finest military minds in the galaxy. Elias knew that if he faltered, if he miscalculated even for a second, it would mean the end. Commander Kahlo, his second in command, stood silently beside him, watching Elias as the countdown to engagement ticked away. The tension between them was unspoken but understood. Khalil had long since come to trust Elias's instincts, but today was different. The stakes were higher, and the odds perhaps for the first time seemed insurmountable. The tactical map showed the Kyran fleet's positioning shifting ever so slightly, as though they were waiting for the Aegis to make the first move. Elias knew better than to take the bait. Patience, that had always been the key. His mind raced through every maneuver, every lesson he had learned throughout this war. This wasn't about raw firepower. It was about using every ounce of human ingenuity to find a weakness in the Kyran's overconfidence. Elias took a deep breath, then turned to Khalil. "We're going to split the fleet. Make it look like a retreat." Khalil's brow furrowed. "A retreat?" "Yes. The Kyran expect us to strike head-on. We won't give them that satisfaction. If we make it look like we're falling back, they'll follow." "And then?" Elias's gaze hardened. "Then we make them chase us into the storm." The storm he referred to was an anomaly detected earlier, a violent nebula filled with magnetic storms and chaotic gravitational forces. It was unstable, dangerous, and lethal to any ship caught in its pull. But that was precisely why Elias saw it as their last, desperate hope. The Kyran ships, for all their technological superiority, were heavily reliant on precise coordination. In the chaos of the nebula, that advantage would be stripped away. Khalil hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He didn't question Elias's judgment. There wasn't time for doubt. He relayed the orders to the fleet, and soon the human vessels began shifting their formations, peeling away as though preparing to flee. The Kyran fleet followed, their predatory instincts taking over. They moved with deliberate precision, maintaining their advantage in numbers, but that would soon change. As the first human ships entered the edge of the nebula, the storm began to swirl around them, pulling at the hulls and scrambling communications. Elias watched as the Kyran ships followed, their formations becoming less coordinated as the nebula's chaotic forces began to interfere. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The Kyran's overconfidence would be their undoing. "Now," Elias ordered, his voice calm but firm, "execute the diversion." The human fleet split again, this time into smaller, more nimble units that darted through the nebula, using the swirling magnetic storms to hide their movements. The Kyran ships, larger and slower, struggled to keep up. It was like watching a pack of predators lose sight of their prey in the underbrush. Elias's eyes never left the tactical display. The nebulous storms were wreaking havoc on the Kyran sensors, just as he had predicted. Their formations were breaking apart, their ships losing coordination. But this wasn't over. Not yet. "Prepare the gravitic mines," he ordered. The mines had been one of humanity's few true innovations in the war, small, nearly invisible devices that, when activated, created localized gravitational distortions strong enough to tear a ship apart from the inside. They were risky to use in normal space, but in the chaos of the nebula, they would be nearly impossible for the Kyran to detect. As the mines were deployed, Elias watched the Kyran fleet inch closer, unaware of the trap being laid for them. The first explosions rocked the enemy ships, the gravitic mines ripping through their hulls with devastating force. One by one, the Kyran ships were torn apart, their superior technology useless against the raw power of the gravitational distortions. The human fleet, smaller and more agile, weaved through the chaos, avoiding the worst of the nebulous storms and the mine explosions. But even as they gained the upper hand, the cost was high. Several human ships were caught in the crossfire, their hulls buckling under the strain of the nebula's forces. The battle was a brutal dance of survival, every move a gamble with lives hanging in the balance. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained impassive. He couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Not now. He had to stay focused, to see this through to the end. As the Kyran fleet continued to crumble, Elias knew that this was their moment. The enemy was faltering, their lines broken, their ships scattered and vulnerable. But even in victory, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Kyran weren't retreating. They weren't fleeing the battlefield. It was as if they were waiting for something. A cold realization gripped him. "They're stalling," he whispered. Kahlo looked at him, confused. Stalling for what? Elias's mind raced. If the Kyran were stalling, it could only mean one thing: they had reinforcements on the way. And if those reinforcements arrived, humanity's fragile advantage would be wiped away in an instant. "Get us out of the nebula," Elias ordered, his voice urgent. Now. The human fleet began to pull back, retreating from the storm as quickly as they could. But it was too late. As they emerged from the nebula, the reinforcements appeared: another Kyran fleet, larger than the first, emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation. Elias's heart sank. This was it. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and there was nowhere left to run. The final gambit had failed. But as the Kyran reinforcements closed in, Elias felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This wasn't about winning the battle anymore. This was about something greater, something deeper. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to fate. The bridge fell silent as the Kyran ships surrounded them, their weapons trained on the Aegis. Elias stood tall, his gaze unwavering as he faced the inevitable. In that moment, as the stars loomed large around them and the vastness of the universe pressed in from all sides, Elias understood. This was always more than just a war. It was a test of their will, their courage, their very humanity. And in that final, fleeting second, Elias knew that they had passed. They had fought not just for survival, but for something more, something eternal. And as the Kyran weapons fired, the darkness of space swallowed the Aegis whole, leaving only the echoes of their struggle in its wake. The war was over, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the chaos that had preceded it. The skies, once teeming with the streaks of battle, now lay still and empty, save for the faint glow of distant stars. On the surface of what remained of Earth, Elias Varro stood alone, gazing out at the horizon where the first rays of sunlight broke through the dust-choked atmosphere. The light should have symbolized hope, a new beginning, but for Elias, it felt more like a reminder of everything that had been lost. The final battle against the Kyran Empire had shattered humanity, but it had also brought them victory, at a great cost. The names of the fallen echoed in Elias's mind like a never-ending roll call: Layla Reyes, Mary Quinn, Commander Khalil. They had all paid the ultimate price, sacrificing themselves for a future they would never see. Elias could still feel the weight of Layla's last moments, her eyes filled with quiet determination as she had made the ultimate sacrifice for the Aegis and the crew. Her absence was a gaping wound that time would never heal. Elias inhaled deeply, the acrid scent of burning wreckage still lingering in the air. The Kyran fleets had been decimated, their empire shattered, but that victory felt hollow. The human race had survived, yes, but at what cost? In the end, they had become almost indistinguishable from the enemy they had fought so hard to defeat: calculating, ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for the sake of survival. He turned away from the horizon and walked slowly through the remains of the Aegis, or what little was left of it. The once great ship had been reduced to ruins, its hull scorched and broken. As he walked, memories of the war washed over him, every decision he had made, every sacrifice, every soul he had sent to their death. It weighed on him now more than ever. The burden of command that had once seemed necessary now felt like a cruel joke. He had led them to victory, but at what cost? The surviving crew was scattered across the landscape, some working to repair what they could, others sitting in silence, their expressions hollow and haunted. They had been through hell, and now, even in the light of victory, there was no celebration, no joy, only the quiet, lingering grief of those who had seen too much. Elias spotted Captain Voss, one of the few remaining officers, sitting on a piece of debris, staring off into the distance. Voss had always been pragmatic, a man of action, but now he looked lost, as though the end of the war had left him without purpose. Elias approached him, but for a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with everything that words couldn't express. Finally, Voss broke the silence. "It's over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But it doesn't feel like it." Elias nodded, understanding exactly what Voss meant. We won, Elias replied, though the words felt empty. But the cost? Voss looked up at him, his eyes bloodshot and weary. What now? He asked, the question hanging in the air like a specter. Elias didn't have an answer. The war was over, but the future was uncertain. They had fought to free humanity from the Kyran. But now that the battle was done, what kind of world had they inherited? What kind of people had they become in the process? The remnants of the Kyran Empire had crumbled, but there were whispers of other forces lurking in the shadows, remnants of the Empire, rogue factions, and power-hungry individuals who sought to fill the void left behind. Even as they stood amidst the wreckage of the war, Elias knew that the fight for humanity's future was far from over. As if sensing his thoughts, Voss spoke again, his voice tinged with bitterness. We fought to escape their rule, but what if we've just created a new empire in their place? What if we're no better than the Kyran? Elias didn't respond immediately. It was a question he had asked himself many times in the sleepless nights after each battle. The war had been fought in the name of freedom, but freedom had come at a price, and that price had been paid in blood. The lines between right and wrong had blurred so much that Elias wasn't sure if they even existed anymore. We didn't fight to become them, Elias said finally, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. We fought because we believed there was a better way, a future where we could be free. But what does that future look like? Voss pressed, his voice filled with frustration. We've lost so much. We've sacrificed everything. And for what? A world that's just as broken as it was before, if not worse. Elias sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He didn't have the answers. No one did. The war had been fought for ideals, for the idea of a better future. But now that the battle was over, they were left with the reality of what that future might actually look like. And the reality was far more complicated than the ideals they had once held so dearly. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a harsh light over the ruined landscape, Elias knew that their journey wasn't over. The war had ended, but the real challenge was only just beginning. Rebuilding, healing, finding a way to move forward without losing sight of the reasons they had fought in the first place. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, where the sun now shone brightly through the dust and debris. It was a new dawn, but it didn't bring with it the hope he had once imagined. Instead, it brought the weight of everything that had been lost, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Voss stood up slowly, wincing as he stretched his sore muscles. We should get to work, he said quietly. There's a lot to be done. Elias nodded. Yes, there is. The two men began walking back toward the makeshift camp the survivors had set up. As they moved through the wreckage, Elias couldn't help but think about the people who had died to bring them to this point: Layla, Khalil, Mary, and countless others. Their sacrifices had been necessary, but that didn't make the loss any easier to bear. In the distance, Elias could see a group of engineers working to salvage what was left of the Aegis. The ship had been their home, their shield, their weapon. Now it was little more than a broken husk, a symbol of the war they had fought and the cost they had paid. Elias approached the engineers, offering them a nod of acknowledgement. They were doing what they could to repair the ship, but it was clear that the Aegis would never fly again. It was too damaged, too broken, just like the people who had fought within it. One of the engineers, a young woman with soot-streaked skin and tired eyes, looked up at Elias as he approached. We'll do what we can, sir, she said, her voice quiet but determined. But I don't think she'll ever be the same. Elias nodded. None of us will. The engineer offered him a small, sad smile before returning to her work. Elias watched her for a moment, then turned and continued walking through the camp. Everywhere he looked, he saw the scars of the war, both on the landscape and on the people who had survived it. There was no going back to the way things had been. The war had changed them all. As Elias walked, he thought about the future. They had fought to free humanity from tyranny, but now that freedom was theirs, what would they do with it? Would they build a better world, or would they fall back into the same patterns of power and control that had led them into war in the first place? The answer wasn't clear, and Elias wasn't sure if it ever would be. but as he looked out at the survivors, the people who had fought and bled for the chance at a new beginning, he knew one thing for certain: they couldn't afford to repeat the mistakes of the past. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and as long as they remembered the sacrifices that had been made, there was still hope that they could build something better, not just for themselves, but for the generations to come. Elias stood at the edge of the camp, staring out at the horizon once more. The sun was higher now, its light casting long shadows across the ground. It was a new dawn, but it was up to them to decide what that dawn would bring. And in that moment, as the wind whispered through the ruins and the weight of the past pressed down on him, Elias made a silent vow to honor the memory of those who had fallen, and to ensure that their sacrifices had not been in vain.